Good evening and welcome to this Maidenhead Development Management Committee. I'd like to welcome and thank you residents who are attending in the council chamber, any downstairs in the Desborough Theatre, and those watching along on YouTube tonight. Due to not having our chair or vice chair present and giving apologies for the meeting, our first item of business will be to elect a chair. Do I have a nomination for chair this evening? Councillor Wilson.
Thank you. I'd like to nominate Councillor Knowles as chair, assuming the technology is working.
Thank you. And is that seconded? Councillor Howard?
Yes.
Are there any other nominations for chair? That's unanimous. Councillor Knowles, we elect you chair for this evening's committee. If you'd like to come up and we'll get started.
Hello and welcome to this meeting of the Maidenhead Development Panel, Development Management Committee on today, the 13th of February 2025. My name is Councillor Neil Knowles, and after the vote therein, I will be chairing this meeting. This meeting is being held in person via Zoom and streamed live to the public on YouTube. I remind all attendees that participation in this meeting indicates consent to the audio and video being streamed live and acknowledgement that after the meeting, it will continue to be available in the public domain. We're not expecting a fire alarm to sound this evening. However, if it does, please may I ask that you leave in an orderly fashion and rendezvous across the road outside the library next to the fountain. Firstly, it would be useful if all voting members and officers could introduce themselves so the public are aware of who is who in this meeting and the role they are undertaking. I think I've introduced myself, so I've moved to my right and we'll follow our way around the room.
Mikey Lloyd, Democratic Service Officer and Clerk to the committee this evening.
Good evening, everybody. Oren Norris-Brown, the Governance and Democratic Services Manager.
Genevieve Gosling, Ward Councillor for Sunningdale and subbing on behalf of a colleague for this panel.
Councillor Jodie Grove, a substitute voting member of the panel.
Councillor Kashmir Singh for Riverside Ward, member of the panel.
Councillor Mark Howard for Cookham and Bisham, substitute member of the panel.
Councillor Devon Davis, substitute member for panel.
Councillor Mark Wilson, substitute member of the panel.
Chris Joyce, Assistant Director for Placemaking, Partnerships and Sustainability.
James Cross, Major Projects Team Leader, representing the application tonight.
Sarah White, Legal Advisor.
And Adrian Waite, Assistant Director of Planning.
I now also request that meeting participants do not speak unless I specifically invite you to do so. And once I've invited you to speak, before you do so, please state your name and the capacity in which you are speaking, if appropriate. I'll also ask officers to speak at appropriate times during the meeting. If any individual attempts to disrupt the meeting, I'm able to use my powers in the Constitution to adjourn the meeting or have the individual removed. I'd also like to remind councillors that to improve our time and effectiveness as a committee, I'd ask you to please limit the repetition of points or questions which have already been raised by others. Where possible, please put forward all new points or questions which you would like raised during your request to speak, to save repetition. We'll now start on the agenda items. We have apologies for absence, which I believe there are a few.
Yes, Chair, thank you. So we have apologies received from Councillors Martin, Councillor Douglas, Councillor Reeves, Councillor Brar, Councillor Gurj Singh. They are being substituted by Councillor Devon Davies, Councillor Wilson and Councillor Howard. We've had apologies from Councillor Hill and Councillor Taylor, substituted by Councillor Knowles and Councillor Grove. and also apologies from Councillor Walters, substituted by Councillor Gosling.
Thank you very much. This where it gets very really embarrassing now, where somebody's calling me and I can't answer. Back in the room. I'm not normally this messed up. Agenda items number 2, declarations of interest. Does anybody have a declaration of interest? If you can press your button and we'll come to you in turn around the room. Councillor Singh.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to make a statement. It would have been impossible for any person in Maidenhead to have arrived at today's meeting without foreknowledge of the development, including various strands of opinion loudly expressed by residents and councillors, all of which were covered extensively in local and sometimes national media. I'm no different to everyone else in this regard. However, I come to tonight's extraordinary meeting with an open mind. I will base my decision solely upon the report, comments of officers, residents, and my fellow councillors. I will not be swayed by anything I have heard, read, or said before tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Singh. Any other declarations of interest? No. Agenda item number 3 would be normally to do the minutes, but as no member of the panel that was present at the last meeting here, it will have to be deferred to the next meeting of the Maidenhead Management Panel. Agenda item number 4 is an outline planning application, which is 24/00091 at Maidenhead Golf Course, Shoppenhangers Road, Maidenhead, SL6 2PZ. Can I ask James, I believe, is introducing this item?
Thank you, Chair. So the first application tonight is the outline application with all matters reserved, except for access, that's Shoppenhangers Road access, Harvest Hill Road principal access, and the Harvest Hill Road secondary access for a residential-led mixed-use development comprising up to 1,500 homes, a range of community uses, including primary and secondary schools, a local centre, and small-scale cafe retail, commercial uses, public open space, including landscaping, associated infrastructure and amenities, together with all associated works, including demolition of the existing buildings on site, except for the existing property at 2 Rushington Avenue, which is to be retained, and temporary meanwhile uses. There's a couple of updates from the published report. The first one is that there's been an updated 5-year housing land supply figure, which is now 4.47 years. That follows updated calculations by our policy team post the report being published. There's been an additional consultation response received from South West Transport, and that will be addressed in the contents of this recommendation. There's also been an amendment to the National Planning Policy Framework as of last week, but we still refer to the December 2024 framework because the documents are the same. The government haven't changed the date on that. And then finally, paragraph 7.1 is just to clarify that the Maidenhead neighbourhood plan has moved on a stage in the statutory process, but the neighbourhood plan still has very limited weight in the decision-making process. So for members' benefit tonight, those updates don't change the recommendation or the substance of the reports that you've got in front of you. So just to go really back to basics in terms of decision-taking for members' benefit tonight, we just want to note that planning committee decisions are quasi-judicial processes and they are to be evidence-based led. Planning law, which is set out in section 38(6) of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act, requires decisions to be made in accordance with the policies contained within the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. There is a legal duty that is under section 38(6), which is imposed upon decision takers, that's including committee members and officers alike, to make sure that they do obviously start with the development plan policies in the first instance when they do consider planning applications. So tonight, members will need to assess this application in the context of the tilted balance. Following the introduction of the December 2024 National Planning Policy Framework, central government have imposed new housing requirements on the borough, which has increased the housing needs. The NPPF is clear in that policies most relevant for determining the planning application, which in this case is the housing policies, are now considered to be out of date and therefore the tilted balance applies. Now, what that means for decision taking is that the development should be approved unless any harms arising from the development are of both significant and demonstrable nature. And I've underlined the word "and" there for members' benefit because both of those limbs would need to be satisfied. So therefore, the threshold required to be met to resist development of this nature is now significantly higher than what it was before the NPPF was updated in December 2024. So I've tried to split up the presentation because we are going to be here for a little while, but it's important we go through the points. I think we've got about 45 minutes in presentation tonight. I've tried to separate it out into 6 different parts just to give a bit of a methodology as we go through the process. So the first one is to go through the background of the site. Now, obviously, a lot of people today will be aware that the applicant and the owner of the site is RBWM. And the owner's agent, so RBWM's agent, is the RBWM property company, and the owner's appointed developer is that of Carla Homes. Members should note that the local planning authority function of the council operates strictly in accordance with the legislation I've just gone through, which governs planning decisions. And the local planning authority function is impartial in its exercise of the town planning functions from the wider council. So for the clarity of both members and public watching tonight, just to let you know that my role here in this process is that I've been appointed to assess the development on behalf of the local planning authority, and I'm not a full-time member of staff for the council. I actually don't live in the borough, never worked in the borough before, and neither do I have any affiliation with the borough. So I'm coming at this from a completely process-driven decision-making perspective. It's also just worth noting that I am a chartered town planner and member of the Royal Town Planning Institute. So I'm required by my profession to abide by strict codes of conduct, which include impartiality in my advice and my exercise of my duties. I'll now pass you over to Sarah, who's on my right here, who's our externally appointed lawyer, just to take you through some points.
Thanks, James. Yes, again, just for clarity, I'm not an officer of the council. I'm an independent lawyer that's been appointed on behalf of the local planning authority. I work for a company called Womble Bond Dickinson. I've not worked for the council before. I don't live in the area, and I will come to this as well with an independent view. It's also worth noting that, as James mentioned, the appointed developer, Carla Homes in this instance, has also got separate legal advice, again, independent of the council, and also the owner's agent. We understand they have independent external legal advice as well. So we've really been very keen to keep a clear separation of functions and advisors in this matter. Thank you.
So moving on to where we are in the process. So the infographic on the screen demonstrates where we are in the application and delivery process of this site. So the application's gone through the local plan allocation stage, after which time there was obviously a subsequent legal challenge, which is quite normal for local plans. It was then followed by the adoption of the local plan, which included the allocation of this site. So the application tonight, obviously the outline application, is really one of the highest levels of applications that can be submitted in the planning profession. And it's very much designed to establish and agree the principles of development from which subsequent detailed matters would latterly come forward as part of other applications. Members will note from their reports that several matters are secured in the later reserved matters applications process, which is entirely normal for size of this site. So obviously when you've read through your reports, you've probably seen there's not lots of detail in there in terms of what it's going to look like and how it might come forward. That will all come through in subsequent applications. So the purpose of an outline application is to establish a framework against which the detailed elements of the scheme can come forward. Members should therefore view this application as almost setting up the building blocks against which subsequent applications would be assessed. So the detailed matters for consideration, such as design of buildings, landscaping, scale, etc., will all come forward as part of reserved matters applications. And you will see that we're at number 4 on that process. So there's lots of other steps to go through before development could commence on site, and that includes things like signing of the corresponding legal agreement, which secures a number of matters, Only then can a permission be issued, and that's an outline permission. We've then got to receive discharge of condition applications, which obviously deal with conditions that have to come in prior to the reserve matters. Again, certain section 106 discharges. Then we get into the details of what it might look like at the reserve matters applications, then further discharge of condition applications and 106 discharges, and then you'd look to commencement of development. So I just want to sort of just really contextualise this for members, that it's not a case of if an approval takes place, it's spades in the ground tomorrow. There's very much layers to go through throughout that process. So to provide a bit of context as to where the allocation site is, what's come forward so far and how it's all piecing together. So the site allocation seeks to deliver circa 2,600 homes across the entirety of the AL13 allocation. And you can see there on the slide, there's the outline of the AL13 allocation. The main aerial view there shows that there's parcels that have come forward so far, so delivery has started to happen on this allocation. And members will note the scheme's south of Harvest Hill Road, which are locally known as the Barclays scheme. So that is number 2 on the screen there, I'm hopefully highlighting. And we've got the Taylor Wimpey scheme down at number 4. There's the Alevio Home scheme that's been permitted at number 5. So there's 3 parcels already permitted on this on the allocation. And number 3 is an application that's currently in with the council for determination at the moment. So far that equates to 457 dwellings on the wider allocation that's been approved. That's across sites 2 and 4 and 5 on the screen. And we've got a further 225 dwellings currently with the council for consideration on site 3. So if we total all that up as to where we are today, we've basically got in for consideration or approved 2,182 dwellings of that 2,600 figure. You'll note there's a parcel there on number 6, and that's will be the final parcel, dare set up the jigsaw puzzle to make up the AL13 allocation, but we don't know what the site yield will be at that. That'll be subject to a further application. So in terms of the site location, the application comprises circa 89 hectares of the AL13 Southwest Maidenhead strategic allocation, and the site comprises the former Maidenhead golf course land as indicated on the above red line site location plan. The site is located to the south of Maidenhead town centre, and Maidenhead station is located to the north of the application site, and the town centre is accessible by foot from the site. Harvest Hill Road bounds the southern boundary of the site, and there's existing residential development along the eastern and western boundaries. So you'll see from the extract from the local plan there, it's an extract from our key policies map, and it shows the AL14 allocation located to the southeast of the AL13 allocation, and that is indicated for commercial and industrial uses within the local plan. But what members will note is the dark green shading on the screens, and that shows the greenbelt designation surrounding the site, which acts as a policy stopgap under the local plan for further development. So you'll have to give my best Microsoft Paint illustration here, but the red line on the plan there shows where the site is located. And what that hopefully illustrates to you is that the site is surrounded by existing development, and it shows the proximity of the site to the road network and Maidenhead town centre, which demonstrates the site's sustainable nature in planning terms. So there's a number of on-site constraints which have been considered in the assessment of this development, and these include the public rights of way running through the east to west through the site, through there on that black line. You've then got Rushington Copse, which is an area of ancient woodland shown in the, I want to say, salmon colour there on the screen. And there's several existing trees within the development site, which are shown in the areas of green on that plan. So just to summarise in terms of the background as to where we are, well, planning decisions are quasi-judicial in nature and are taken in accordance with the policies contained within the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. The application is subject to the tilted balance, where development should be approved unless the harm arising from the development is significant and demonstrable in nature when that's weighed against the benefits of the scheme. The site is well connected and sustainably located in planning terms, and the local planning authority has already approved 3 parcels of this allocation already. So I'll move swiftly on now on to part two, which is looking at the proposed development, and we'll specifically look at the principle of the development on the site. And a member should note that the principle of the residential development under this application is being considered. So if members were deciding to approve the development tonight, you'd obviously be acknowledging the principle of development on the site. So the application is submitted in outline only. And the only detailed matter for consideration tonight are matters relating to the accesses at the following junctions. That's Shoppenhangers Road and the two Harvest Hill roads as a primary access and a secondary access. All of the matters, including landscaping, appearance, scale, layout, etc., will comprise reserve matters, and these details will come forward as part of future reserve matters applications at a later date. These reserve matters will be confined to the parameters set out in the parameters plans, which are detailed in the decision notice, and I'll take you through the parameter plans shortly. So in terms of what the application proposes, I'm going to bore everyone to death now reading through this list that we can all read through together. So the proposed development seeks the erection of up to 1,500 homes, including 30% affordable housing and custom self-build provision. Land to facilitate a range of community uses, including the primary and secondary schools. A local centre located to the south of the site. Small-scale cafe and retail uses located to the north of the site. Commercial uses, public open space, including landscaping. Provision of a green spine connecting the north to the south of the site. 100% electric vehicle charging, which will be confirmed at the reserve matters stage. Net zero carbon development, which will be achieved through the measures set out in the sustainability SPD, and the retention of the existing dwelling at 2 Rushington Avenue. In addition to those factors, the applicants have submitted in their documents that the development will generate a number of economic benefits, which will include approximately 146 full-time equivalent jobs throughout the construction phases of the development. And the applicants estimate the development will generate approximately £36 million in residential spend within the borough. So in terms of the parameter plans that have been submitted, and these are parameter plans submitted for approval, the application obviously is made in outline in nature, and therefore there's no sort of detailed plans in terms of appearance and the design of the dwellings. But these will come forward later. Members will note that draft condition 7 of your reports and the recommendation comprises the parameter plans condition. And these are the sole plans that are recommended for approval and will set the parameters and constraints against which all reserve matters would have to conform to. So in total, there's 4 parameter plans being recommended for approval tonight, which comprise the following, which is a building heights parameter plan, the movement and access plan, a land use plan, and a parcel plan. Now, what these parameter plans do is that they set the confines which the subsequent development would have to accord with. And any reserve matters application that would extend beyond these approved parameter plans would simply not be accepted nor permitted. So they're setting outer boundaries, maximum limits, basically, for what the RMs can come forward with. Members will note that there's been a wealth of information submitted in support of the application. I think there's about circa 400 documents on the application file as of today. And a lot of that information is used to assist that how development can come forward. It's to illustrate and provide comfort to officers that the parameter plans that are shown can be delivered in detailed design later on, but we're not considering the detailed design today. Basically, it's just the parameter plans. But there's information on that file to demonstrate comfort, acceptability, suitability. So the application site is allocated in the borough local plan, and it's the largest parcel of the overall 89 hectare AL13 allocation. The pro forma requirement set out in the local plan requires the site to deliver approximately 2,600 dwellings, educational facilities, including primary and secondary school provision, strategic public open space, formal play space and play pitch provision, and multifunctional community hub and retails as part of the local centre. I've just skipped some slides there, I do apologise. So officers have assessed the mix of uses proposed within the outline application, and they've considered that this does meet with the policy that's set out in the site pro forma. So therefore, the principle of development, subject to all other considerations, is deemed to be in accordance with the borough local plan. Now, members will note that as of the 19th of November 2024, the Maidenhead Golf Course was registered as an asset of community value, which I'll refer to as an ACV, just for simplicity's sake, and probably to save my voice this evening. So just for absolute clarity, an ACV is a statutory process that falls outside of the planning system. An ACV means that when land is disposed of, the community is firstly given the opportunity to develop a bid and raise capital to buy the land. An ACV status, and this is the key thing for tonight, is it does not prevent planning permission from being approved on it, and it does not undo the local plan designation on the site for housing development. So it's considered a material consideration, but from officers' view, it's considered with a very, very, very limited weight, almost negligible weight. So one of the other things we've had to consider regarding the principle of development is, does the development result in the loss of public open space? Well, throughout the consultation period of the application, there's been several representations made and received stating that the land comprises public open space. There are two tests which govern the use of open space, which is firstly policy IF4 of the borough local plan and paragraph 104 of the MPPF. So as is set out in the recommendation in your reports, in the assessment of officers, those tests for public open space are not met. That's the planning test for public open space. And officers do acknowledge that local residents may have appreciated some form of visual amenity from the existing outlook. And obviously private members of the golf club will have appreciated the environment through the activities on the land, but this is not of sufficient robustness to fulfil the requirements of the site becoming open space in planning terms. So there is a clear differentiation there in terms of what planning definition is, and obviously what laypersons might deem to be open space. So I just want to make that absolutely clear for members in terms of tonight. Then the next consideration in terms of the principle of development that we've stepped through is, does it result in the loss of a golf club? And I think we know where the next slide is going to go to. So the application site is formally designated for a residential-led mixed-use development within the borough local plan. And obviously throughout the application period, several letters of objection have been raised relating to the loss of the existing golf club facility. The applicants have submitted a golf needs assessment, which has been reviewed by officers in the assessment of the application. The needs assessment has been undertaken in accordance with what we call the ANOG methodology, which concurs with best practice, which is set out by Sport England. Now, the responsibility falls to the local planning authority to assess whether the loss of a golf club, based upon the evidence submitted, is acceptable in planning terms. There's obviously a best practice criteria that documents will go through, but the buck stops with the officers and the local planning authority to make that judgment as to whether it's acceptable or not. So throughout the multiple stages through the allocation of the site to the local plan, when obviously this matter was considered, it was deemed to be acceptable. And officers are satisfied at this stage, and we've had obviously legal reviews on this point, etc., that sufficient evidence has been provided within this application to demonstrate that the loss of the golf club facility would be sufficiently met elsewhere within the locality. So whilst officers do appreciate that using alternative facilities may be less convenient compared to a site in the same location, sufficient capacity has been demonstrated to exist within the locality to meet the existing needs in planning terms. That's the planning test that we have to go through. So on that basis, it's been considered the criteria in paragraph 104A of the MPPF has been met, and officers are therefore satisfied in planning terms that the loss of the golf club facility is acceptable within the consideration of this application tonight. So just to summarise those points, so the application is submitted in outline in nature, and the only elements being sought for approval is the principle of development, the detailed accesses, and 4 parameter plans. We've received sufficient information that demonstrates the loss of the golf course would not adversely affect the provision of the sporting facilities. The site does not comprise open space in planning terms, and the assets of community value designation controls the disposal of land and is not considered to be a material planning consideration of overriding weight. So part 3 of the presentation takes you through the parameter plans for approval. And I've touched upon earlier, there's only 4 parameter plans for approval, which I'll take you through one by one now. So the first parameter plan is the parcel plan. So the application is accompanied by a series of parameter plans, which will form the basis of the subsequent reserve matters applications. And now it's normal for schemes of this size and scale to not include all matters relating to design and layout, because those matters come through the subsequent reserve matters applications. The parameter plans will comprise approved plans, which then the latter reserve matters applications have to accord with. And the priority for the decision maker, and this is obviously members tonight, is just to ensure that the parameter plans approved now reflect the placemaking principles in the borough local plan. And from officers' perspectives in our recommendation, we're satisfied that that is the case. The second parameter plan that's been submitted for approval is the movement and access parameter plan. And this secures a number of key non-vehicular routes, which will increase the accessibility throughout the site by non-vehicular modes of transport. The parameter plans secure the provision of the green spine running through the middle of the site. Hopefully you can see the colour green on the screen. It runs down the site north to south and then across there east to west to the Harvest Hill Junction. And subject to the conditions set out in this report, the requirements of Active Travel England are met in this development. So this parameter plan secures the provision of new non-vehicular connection points at the northern, that's up here, the eastern, down here at the public right of way, and the western points, and also down here on the south by the local centre will be. And there's no through access along the green spine for motor vehicles, but buses, pedestrians and cycles would have through access. And the intent behind that is to make sure that it's easier to get from north to south, not using the car. Then we move on to the building heights parameter plan. And I just want to be really, really clear as to what the parameter plan is, the effect of the parameter plan. So the building heights parameter plan would permit a maximum building height, which could be capable of achieving support at the reserve matters stage. So the plan doesn't automatically mean that this maximum height is acceptable. It just means that any buildings above these heights couldn't be submitted to the council. And the approval of this parameter plan doesn't stop officers considering that lower building heights could be more acceptable in the subsequent reserve matters application. And that's really basically if site-specific factors necessitate this. So it's really setting a maximum cap that can't be exceeded for the future applications. And the final and fourth parameter plan is the land use parameter plan, which outlines where specific land uses would fall within the subsequent reserve matters applications. This should be read in conjunction with the parcel parameter plan, and the land use parameter plan outlines the outermost extents of these uses. So there's nothing, again, that would prevent officers within the reserve matters applications from restricting these land uses further away from the neighbouring properties in the interest of residential amenity. And just to give you an example of what I mean by that. So if you look, for example, on the western boundary of the site, although the colour is a cream colour on the screen, which is helpful, that cream colour goes right up to the boundary. That doesn't mean that buildings will be up against the boundary. It just means that the use, i.e. things like garden spaces, intervening landscaping, could go that far. But again, we've got to assess the acceptability of that at the reserve matters stage against the council's design guidance, against the council's policies. But it just broadly sets out where certain uses will follow. But the details of it all, the acceptability of those details will come forward within the detailed reserve matters applications. So until officers can see those detailed designs in the reserve matters applications, and that would include things like separation distances and screening and planting, etc., then we've got no reason at this stage to conclude why that relationship would be unacceptable in principle. So we're quite satisfied in principle. We can secure those details later on in the process. So in terms of the summary for the 4 parameter plans, it's only 4 that have been proposed for approval. These parameter plans would comprise the outermost limits And these parameters obviously can be restricted further at the reserve matters stages if there is a reason to. Those parameter plans set the maximum limits, and any reserve matters applications that exceed these simply couldn't be accepted. So hypothetically, a building height is shows on the parameter plan 3 stories. If it comes in at 4, it just doesn't get considered. It's very, very simple. So it's a maximum cap. And there's an opportunity for the consideration of reserve matters applications to be brought back to committee for determination. That's under the council scheme of delegation and our constitution. Now, part 4 of this presentation, we'll move on to what we call specific matters, which relate to detailed and topical matters, so very specific items. Now, whilst members, you're only considering the principle of development, the 3 accesses, and the 4 parameter plans, we also have to give consideration to these detailed specific matters to ensure that an acceptable development can come forward. So looking at the parameter plans, does it prejudice acceptable development from coming forward? So you might sort of flip and change from different items, but that's what we've got to do to go through the process. So do bear with me. So the first matter is the mix of uses. So the land use parameter plan shows the provision of a local centre to the south, which will comprise a minimum of a 380 square metre food store, 200 square metre retail takeaway units, 950 square metres healthcare facility, 557 square metres community hub. Within the northern neighbourhood is a mixed-use ground floor space, which will provide a minimum floor area of 350 square metres. The purpose of these various offerings is to serve the residents of the development and not to compete with the offerings of the Maidenhead Town Centre. I say that in terms of quantity of floor space, basically. There's obviously nothing stopping someone from coming into the area and using the facilities, but the quantum of floor space is being designed so that it doesn't compete with the Maidenhead Town Centre. So the provision of the local centre, now I've put the illustrative arrangement of the local centre to demonstrate how it could come forward. It's not for approval tonight, but it's an illustration to show how it could come forward. The local centre to the south will be triggered prior to the occupation of 50% of the units in the south. Now, the reason why that trigger point of 50% of occupations of the corresponding neighbourhood is considered sufficient is just due to critical mass. So we acknowledge that population firstly needs to exist before commercial occupiers of these floor space will want to move to the floor space. So there's no point in bringing down the trigger lower to have an empty vacant unit just sat there. That's not in anyone's interest. So we've concluded that 50% trigger for the delivery of that local centre is the appropriate balance, taking into account those factors. Then we've got the mix of education provision and within the mix of uses. And the land use parameter plan and parcel plan details the provision of primary and secondary school land. The provision of the land to meet educational needs will serve both the future residents of this development in addition to meeting the wider needs of the borough. So it's got a dual purpose in that respect. The consultation discussions with Achieving for Children, who are our body that inform us as the local education authority, have confirmed that a reserve matters application for the primary school will need to be submitted within 6 months following the occupation of the 500th dwelling on the site. And that trigger point is informed by their future trajectories, population demands, pupil yields, etc. And that will be secured within the corresponding legal agreement, which will run alongside the application. And then further, Achieving for Children has also recommended that the reserve matters application be made for the secondary school within 6 months following the occupation of the 1000th dwelling on the site. And again, that trigger point has been informed by looking at capacity in the local area, what the population demands are, future trends, etc., etc. And that's what informs those trigger points. So again, that will be secured through the corresponding legal agreement. The one point I would just make for members, just to make it absolutely clear, is that that's the latest they can submit their applications by. If it's needed to come forward earlier, then they can do that. They're not breaching any terms or any permissions in that regard. So there is that flexibility there. And the reason why I say that is with the new MPPF, new housing numbers, there's new pressures on community facilities, infrastructure facilities, they might need to bring that forward. but the local education authorities got a duty to meet the school places. So we've got land within council ownership, depending on how tonight goes, potentially with an approval, and it's just about the local education authority bringing it forward, maybe earlier when it's needed. So members will note that the description of development refers to meanwhile uses on the land. And given the trigger points relating to the education provision, the education land obviously will be open for an intervening period of time. And concerns have been raised by third parties throughout the application period about what may or may not take place in this land in the intervening period. So for the sake of clarity, any meanwhile uses would be subject to a separate temporary planning application, which would be submitted in the same manner as every other planning application to the council for consideration. There isn't any automatic approval of any meanwhile uses under the terms of this draft planning permission and legal agreement. However, the inclusion of meanwhile uses has solely been included to prevent the legal obligations being triggered through other interim uses on the land, basically. So it's therefore specific wording, and it's used to carve out specific aspects of the legal agreement. So it's just a purely technical point. If there were meanwhile uses coming forward, it would have a planning application, it would have to come to the council and be back before committee members under the Constitution. The next point to take you through is about housing delivery and how it comes forward on these large sites. So the residential aspects of the development will come forward on the relevant parcels as identified in the parcel parameter plan. Development will come forward as phases within relevant parcels. So you can have parcel 1, phase A, phase B, phase C, for example. But prior to any development coming forward, the applicants are required to submit a design code for the northern and southern neighbourhoods. So the northern neighbourhood there on the screen is denoted by that line there, the top half of it. Southern neighbourhood, obviously, in the south of the bottom half of the site. They are required to come into the council for consideration before the determination of the first reserve matters application. So we'll start to get clarity of what buildings will look like, design principles, etc., before we actually look to approve reserve matters applications. The development will be built out in phases. However, prior to any development taking place, a neighbourhood infrastructure phasing strategy, that's draft condition 9 of your reports, will be required across the residential parcels and wider developments. So therefore, whilst development will come forward in phases and in the parcels, there will be clarity and certainty regarding the infrastructure necessary to serve the development. And that is all, the delivery and coordination of that is covered under draft condition 9 of your reports. The next thing to talk about is design codes. Now, members will note that the design and appearance of development are all matters for consideration within the latter reserve matters applications. The development will be split between 2 neighbourhoods, a northern neighbourhood and a southern neighbourhood. These neighbourhoods are identified within the parcel parameter plan. That's the one I showed you on the previous screen there. Draft conditions 5 and 6 of your reports require the applicant to submit a full design code for the northern and southern neighbourhoods prior to the submission of the first reserve matters application. So we get to understand the design principles of what might come forward within those reserve matters applications before they're submitted. So it's about layering up the process. Those design codes will set out more detailed design criteria against which subsequent reserve matters applications will need to be complied with. Members will note that a full design code has been submitted with the application. However, this was submitted as illustrative material to demonstrate how this development could come forward, but it's not for approval tonight. That would come forward as part of separate discharge of condition applications. The next specific matter to talk to you about is the green spine. So before any applications for any residential development are allowed, the applicants will be required to submit a full reserve matters application for the green spine. The green spine is defined by the extent set out in the land use parameter plan and parcel plan, and it's shown on the left-hand side of your screen. That's funnily enough, the green line going through the centre of the site. The green spine will not comprise a through road as to avoid rat running, but it will facilitate a through bus route. And again, that's to establish non-vehicular modes of transport being the most readily and accessible method of getting through the site. A bus gating barrier is proposed in the middle of the green spine, and it's broadly in that location just there. And that is denoted on the parameter plans that will be approved. And the conditions of the green spine have been included in response to the comments received by Active Travel England. So the green spine will also feature a segregated pedestrian and cycle route, which will run alongside the main green spine. And this will ensure travelling through the development by non-car modes of transport are more favourable than taking the private car. The green spine will therefore only provide access-only trips, but it doesn't provide wider relief for the wider highways network. So it's an access-only road, really, in all effects. Don't wish to dumb that down through the process, but that's the reality of the function of it. So draft condition 19 requires the relevant parts of the green spine, which provides access to the residential parcels, to be provided and fully operational prior to the first occupation of the residential unit. So what that means is when a parcel comes along, they're required to provide that part of the green spine, so it builds it up as they go through the process. So you've always got access to the residential parcels. The next thing to talk about is the housing mix schedule. So the application proposes a mixed-use residential-led development, which will deliver up to 1,500 homes. A development of this size and scale is likely to take approximately 10 years. I say that, well, it can ebb and flow, obviously, with the external market factors, but on average, 10 years. So as a result of this, draft condition 20 of your report requires each reserved matters application to be accompanied by a housing mix schedule, which sets out how subsequent reserved matters applications will meet the housing mix set out in the South West Maidenhead SPD. Within the submitted housing mix schedules with the RM applications, the applicants will be required to submit a housing delivery schedule, which evidences the emerging housing mix across the entirety of the site. So a bit like it will monitor how much has come forward, so that everyone can see with full transparency how much of the housing type has been brought forward. The reason why we do that is to make sure that we're not, dare I say, putting one house type or less favourable house type to the end of the development and burdening the last parcel. So making sure it's properly considered, and we're monitoring that arrangement as we go through the process. So officers do acknowledge that the nature of the development will differ across different parts of the site. However, the housing delivery schedule condition will allow sufficient monitoring of the housing mix as development is delivered. The next thing to talk to you about is custom self-build housing. And the Borough Local Plan requires the development to provide for 5% of the market dwellings as custom self-build housing. In this instance, the development will deliver 53 dwellings towards meeting the council's custom self-build housing register. Members should note that there is a statutory duty placed upon the local planning authority to deliver the equivalent number of custom self-build plots as they have on their custom self-build register throughout that base period. So at the time of this report, the council should be delivering approximately 165 plots within the last base period, and this development would meet 53 of those 165 plots. So the detail of these provisions will be secured through the corresponding legal agreement. The next specific matter to go through is affordable housing provision. So to put this into context, at the time of this recommendation, the borough has 700 households on their housing register. The council's strategic housing market assessment, we'll call that SHMA, very smooth term, the SHMA, requires the delivery of 434 additional affordable homes each year. But that figure is obviously based on older housing trajectories, which are pre-MPPF. So the needs have likely increased since that 434 figure. So I make that as an illustrative point, not as a point to make your decision on. And the development will deliver 450 new affordable homes throughout the lifetime of its development. So based upon, again, this magic 10-year build-out period, this would equate to approximately 45 new affordable homes each year, assuming a linear delivery rate. Importantly for members to note tonight, the corresponding legal agreement will require the applicant to deliver the affordable homes in the relevant parcel prior to the occupation of 50% of the open market homes in that parcel. So whenever they're building out a parcel, they can't occupy more than 50% of the open market housing until the affordable housing is provided. So that is an early trigger in schemes of this size. And obviously that's in response to the need for affordable housing that we've got in our borough. So in terms of trees and landscaping, submitted with the application is the land use parameter plan, which sets out the areas of strategic open space. This is centred around Rushington Copse in the centre of the site. And the delivery of this area comprises a strategic placemaking aspiration as set out in the Borough Local Plan and South West Maidenhead SPD. There have been obviously several letters of objection submitted within the application period, which raises concerns over the potential loss of trees from the site. For the sake of clarity, the council comprises the owner of this site, and therefore any removal of trees would have to be authorised by them as the landowner. It's the same sense with any other piece of land that someone can't do works to sites that they don't own. So the council, obviously being the freeholder of this site, control what is on the site as existing. That's before developers would move on to do works. Now, draft condition 15 of your report requires any tree loss can only be undertaken as part of an approved reserve matters application. Now, the reason why it's important is between now and an approval of reserve matters application, trees are protected by the council's ownership on the site. Then once a reserve matters application is approved and the developers can go onto the site, the trees and any tree loss or tree protection, whatever that may look like in the future, would then be controlled by the permission. So both pre-permission and post-permission, there's controls over trees and loss of trees. And that approach is fully consistent with criteria 4 of policy NR3 of the Borough Local Plan. And the reason why we've reserved the consideration of loss of trees to the reserve matters application is because we want to know that any loss of trees is well considered, and we're only permitting that when we know what the development would be around it and what any benefits it would be in the balance. Now, officers deem it appropriate at the reserve matters stage that additional protections in the form of things like TPOs could be placed upon notable trees to ensure additional legal protections. So say, for example, the reserve matters came in, it had a notable tree in the middle, we could easily place a TP on that site just as a population moves in. So it gets picked up in the latter stages of the development. The next specific matter to talk you through is ecology. So as set out in the trees and landscaping section of this presentation, ecology also comprises a matter which officers deem most appropriate to be dealt with at the reserve matters stage. The application has been submitted with a supporting phase 1 ecology survey. However, given the likely length of the build-out period, and I'll refer back to my magic 10 years, officers do not wish to permit a blanket approach at this stage where the nature of the species and habitats could be different further along in the development process. Obviously, none of us have a crystal ball. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, but it might look different in 10 years' time. So we've got enough information to conclude where we are today and be quite comfortable that no species will be adversely affected. But again, we're just putting additional safeguards, additional comfort into that by requesting further surveys later on down the line. And that is covered in condition 11 of your draft reports. So just be absolutely clear for members' benefit tonight, officers are satisfied that they have sufficient information to conclude that on-site ecological constraints will not be affected by the development proceeding in principle. And the requirement of further surveys is solely to provide up-to-date information about the condition of land in the future, which is just stuff we don't know now and nobody does know. Members will also note in their reports from paragraph 10.271 onwards that 3 individual special areas of conservation have been considered. The local planning authority has undertaken an appropriate assessment, which is a separate process to go through under the conservation and habitats regulations. And that's been done in consultation with Natural England. and it can be concluded that likely significant effects will not arise as a result of the development, and that's been accorded with by Natural England as well. And then in line with recent case law in this matter, further appropriate assessments will be done at the reserve matters stages. The next matter to go through is public open space and play space. And the proposed land use plan shows several areas of open space which form strategic open space. The land use parameter plan shows the provision of a NEEP, which is what we call a neighbourhood equipped area of play, which is south of Rushington Copse, and that is shown on the star on the centre of the site there. And this NEEP will act as a key destination for families within the development. Leaps and laps, they're the smaller areas of play, so locally equipped areas of play, and they will come forward as part of the individual reserve matters application. So they tend to get built into the residential parcels, so you've got housing surrounding them, and they're generally to serve the localised needs of those properties in proximity to it. So the appropriate time to consider the delivery of leaps and laps is at the reserve matters stage, when their purpose, function and relationship will be better known. In terms of transport and highways, and this is the detailed junctions that are submitted for approval. As we set out at the start of this presentation, the application is submitted in outline only, with the only detailed matters for consideration comprising the specific junctions detailed in the description of developments. The highways arrangements of these junctions are set out in Appendix B of your reports. But shown on the screen is the proposed main vehicular access off Harvest Hill Road at the south of the site. These junctions have been reviewed by the local highways authority, both in terms of safety and capacity, and have all been considered to operate without any issue when the development is at full capacity. The wider highways network junctions have also been reviewed by National Highways. That's where they relate to the strategic road networks. We're talking motorways here. And subject to the points of clarification having been provided to them throughout the application process, they have not raised any objection to the development. So therefore, in terms of the junctions submitted, the development is considered to be acceptable. So in terms now of flood risk and drainage, the site falls wholly within flood zone 1, which is the lowest possibility of flooding. So you've got flood zone 1, which is low, 2 and 3, which is your want to be considering quite strongly. Flood zones 2 and 3 are shown there on the right of the screen, which is in the darker shading. And these flood zones fall outside the application site boundary. The light blue shading there in the centre of the site is surface water flooding. And members will note that the site is affected by limited areas of surface water flooding, which is shown on your screen. The underlying geology of the site, which comprises clay, silt and sand, does make infiltration virtually impossible, and therefore discharging water off-site is the appropriate means of surface water discharge. And this is an approach that's been supported and scrutinised by the lead local flood authority. Draft condition 10 requires each reserve matters application to include a drainage scheme, which will provide details of surface water flooding mitigation measures. And this can only be known at reserve matters stage when the extent of hard surfacing from buildings and other man-made features are known. The wording of draft condition 10 requires each reserve matters application to demonstrate how it will support the wider SUDS features across the entirety of the site. So though the details are coming forward on reserve matter by reserve matter basis, they've still got to demonstrate how it contributes to the wider SUDS features of the development. And that ensures that each individual drainage scheme for each reserve matters application will tie into the wider and overall SUDS features of the development. And then just finally on specific matters, the site also falls within a minerals and waste safeguarding area, and it's therefore subjected to the additional policies in the Joint Minerals and Waste Plan. Now, RBWM as the local planning authority has got jurisdiction over the minerals and waste planning functions in our unitary authority role. Throughout the application process, letters of objection have been received seeking prior extraction from the site, and initial surveys have been submitted by the applicants, which officers have assessed in full. Officers have deemed that prior extraction would not be appropriate in this instance. However, members will note draft condition 29 of your reports, which require each reserve matters application to be accompanied by what's called a waste and material management strategy. This will be submitted to the local planning authority to determine whether any prior extraction is capable within that relevant parcel. If reuse of material is found to be acceptable, it would require the material to be reused within the development site itself. So it wouldn't be carted off elsewhere, it'd be reused for building the development site itself. So it cuts down all things like mileage, et cetera, and all the impacts that come with disposing of material off site. But I just want to give absolute clarity to members from officers' perspective that even in the eventuality that minerals were definitively present, officers are content that when we apply the tilted balance, and we'll get onto this section at the end, that the use of prior extraction condition is appropriate and acceptable in the consideration of all of the factors. So in summary, the detailed matters will be picked up in the reserve matters application. There is no reason to suggest from the parameter plan submitted that acceptable details couldn't come forward at the reserve matters stage. And the permission has been structured so that these matters of details can be picked up. I'll just move now on to infrastructure delivery. So the application was assessed, and this is in terms of, off-site highways works. So the application was assessed as part of the strategic transport assessment at local plan stage, where subject to the mitigation set out in figure 7 on the screen above, that's figure 7 in your reports as well, the development was deemed to likely operate successfully. The application has been supported by a transport assessment submitted by the applicants, which contains more detailed modelling, which gives an up-to-date picture of existing and anticipated transport behaviours. Now, you'll know from the evidence base undertaken at local plan stage, there's been modal shifts, COVID, working from home, so that's why there's updated information has been submitted within the application process. That's entirely normal, is what we want to see as a local authority. That information submitted confirmed that the findings of the local plan and the appropriate mitigation would remain valid. Members will note that National Highways requested clarification throughout the duration of this application, and this clarification was provided, and they've confirmed that subject to the draft conditions, there was development. National Highways have also responded under separate cover to the late letter sent from South West Transport, which is an objection in nature. And this was received outside of the consultation period, but National Highways have reviewed it just to give an updated picture and clarity at that point. And they've confirmed back to South West Transport that the findings of their consultation response remain unchanged. The corresponding legal agreement will provide for the infrastructure contribution, which can be used to fund improvements towards the Norreys Drive, Shoppenhangers Road and Hollyport Road and Braywick Road, Harvest Hill junctions. These junctions will be funded through 106 at the appropriate time when monitoring demonstrates the necessity to bring these improvements forward. The schemes on the right-hand side of the table on figure 7 on the screen will be funded through seal receipts generated from the development, and that's subject to internal allocation by RBWM's seal team. So taking these factors into account, both National Highways and the Local Highways Authority have confirmed that the development is acceptable in terms of off-site highways matters, obviously subject to the infrastructure contributions being made. The legal agreement will also make provision for items of infrastructure which are set out on the screen above. Now, we can read through them together now. So that is the provision of 30% affordable housing across the whole site, provision of safeguarded land for custom self-built housing development, provision of the land and land costs for the delivery of the primary school and secondary school and community facilities, provision of healthcare facilities, provision of 10% biodiversity net gain, provision of open space and its corresponding management, contributions to highways improvements and infrastructure, and contributions towards monitoring the operation of Braywick Park Roundabout and Braywick Leisure Centre Junction. So to conclude this presentation, I look at my time here, I've been going for about an hour now, so hopefully this might be welcome news for everyone. But members should note again that the planning committee decisions are quasi-judicial in nature and they're to be evidence-based led. And that is set out in section 38(6), which says that planning law requires decisions to be made in accordance with the policies contained within the development plan, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. This is a statutory duty placed upon decision makers. We don't get a choice about it. We sign up to it when we do our jobs. And this applies to committee members also when they consider planning applications. We obviously do note, and we've seen from the plethora of objection letters on the application files, that this scheme does raise several concerns and alternative views and varied emotions. But to ensure decisions get taken in an impartial and unbiased manner, decision takers are required to be guided by the policies contained within the development plan. So then we turn to what we call the flat or horizontal balance and the tilted balance. So this application is subjected to the tilted balance, but we always go through the flat balance first to go, what would it look like anyway? So when assessing the development against the policies contained within the development plan, on the whole, officers conclude that development accords with these policies. There are no material considerations of overriding weight to indicate that the decision should be taken otherwise, and therefore under a flat or horizontal planning balance, officers recommend development for approval. Now, as I stated at the start of the presentation, this scheme is required to be assessed with a tilted balance applied. And that means that the starting point is for approving development. And there's a much higher threshold for refusing development now. So decision takers would need to be able to clearly demonstrate that the benefits of the development are outweighed by the harms that are both significant and demonstrable in nature. So it's that higher threshold introduced under the MPPF. Now, officers have done their own assessment under the tilted balance, and we've considered that the benefits of the proposed development as a whole, and considered that these are not outweighed by significant and demonstrable harms, and therefore planning permission is recommended for approval. So in summary, it's recommended to committee to authorise the Assistant Director of Planning to firstly grant outline planning permission subject to the completion of a satisfactory legal agreement and subject to the conditions listed in section 14 of this report, and 2, such amendments as considered appropriate to ensure the acceptable implementation of the development. Thank you for bearing with me. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, James, for, I think we'll all agree, a very, very detailed report and brief for everybody. We now come on to the part of the meeting where we'll be asking for public speakers to come forward. In agreement with the applicant, speaking time has been expanded considerably so that the objectors will each have 3 minutes each. The applicants will have 9 minutes and other councillors will have 3 minutes each as well. So it's a very, I think, an acceptable arrangement. The first speaker for the objectors will be Mr. Andrew Hill. The usual rules apply. 3 minutes once you're ready to go and start speaking, and Michael will give you a 1 minute warning before completion. Mr. Hill, the floor is yours.
Thank you. The officer just said that the golf needs assessment complied with national policy, but he did not tell you that Sport England that set national policy object to that. The Great Park Group commissioned experts SWTP Limited to analyse the traffic assessment. Carla's future year models are fundamentally derived from 8-year-old 2016 traffic data with anomalies. Carla did commission some new car trip data, but the independent expert found this to be, quote, illogical and counterintuitive Why? Well, believe it or not, Carla's model states that people who live closer to the railway station will drive their cars more than people who live further away on the Harvest Hill end. Councillors, you're voting tonight to change the entire road network for Maidenhead for all time based on 2016 traffic data and car trip data that predicts that people who live next to train stations drive more than people at the edge of town. Our expert tells you you may reject that safely under MPPF 116 because there is, quote, currently insufficient analysis of potentially severe residual cumulative traffic impacts. The second major problem is the leisure centre. Carla's own data predicts 40-minute queues outside the leisure centre unless we add a new gyratory roundabout. But Carla says to make the roundabout work, we must make one massive compromise, their word, and create a traffic queue that will be, quote, stored safely within the leisure centre site. Their data states an evening RFC value of 1.03, which in plain English means an overcapacity failing junction. They are literally planning, in their own words, to store cars in a traffic jam in the leisure centre car park every night. This compromise obviously breaches MPPF 96 by failing to provide safe and accessible sporting facilities and will force cars to use Bray as a rat run. The mitigation will need its own mitigation.
1 minute remaining.
So the tilted balance is not a problem tonight. You are being asked to remove sport and open space from the golf club side of the road and to simultaneously cripple the leisure centre and the rugby club on the other side. If that's not significant and demonstrable harms outweighing benefits, then I don't know what is. The final problem is debt and risk. Our independent expert warns you that if you approve this tonight, you're also approving changes to 5 junctions in the SPD, such as the Thicket roundabout, at our financial risk. And MPPF 115D says that this panel must ensure these 5 junctions are cost-effective mitigations, but you haven't been given the costs, so you can't know it's cost-effective. There is a £40.7 million funding gap in the infrastructure plan. So you do not need to be remembered tonight as the Carla councillors. You can quote MPPF 96, 115D, 116, because the adverse harms significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. I love Maidenhead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hill. Can we next have Tino Cudrino? Same rules apply, Tina. When you're ready to speak, start speaking. We start the time.
Thank you, Chair. I object to this environmentally damaging application, particularly over its impact to the ancient woodland, as well as the loss of other valuable woodland habitats. MPPF paragraph 186C states, when determining planning applications, local planning authorities should apply the following principles. Development resulting in the loss or deterioration of irreplaceable habitats, such as ancient woodland, should be refused. At a minimum, the application should include the following conditions. Re-evaluation of the site as a habitat for nature. The effects of these proposals have not been fully evaluated, nor the loss of habitat appropriately mitigated. This is contrary to RBWM Local Plan Policy NR2, as these proposals do not demonstrate how they maintain, protect and enhance the biodiversity of this application site. Buffer zone and wildlife corridor. As per the Woodland Trust and other objections, for a development of this scale, a buffer zone of at least 50 metres is required to prevent adverse impacts such as pollution and disturbance to the ancient woodlands. A wildlife corridor must be planned, created and protected from the outset, connecting to nearby natural spaces. Removal of Rushington copse from the NEAP calculations. The play provision is right next to the ancient woodland. This is too precious for playing in. Please note that Natural England and the Forestry Commission state ancient woodland takes hundreds of years to establish and is defined as an irreplaceable habitat. Community Management Trust, section 4.7 of
minute
the
remaining.
planning statement states, the applicant supports the provision of a community management trust to be established early on through the provision of continued public access to the site and space to meet, to be addressed via a condition of outline planning permission. Why is this condition not included in your report? We ask the panel to refuse this application or defer it and demand the developer rework the ecology aspects related to this development. And the residents of this borough must be allowed under the ACV designation to bid on and buy the ancient woodland and as much of the other woodland areas as possible. If the council cannot save public open space or green belt, then at the very least, let the community protect our woodland for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. George Midgley. Hello, George. The same applies to you with the brief. So when you're ready to speak, we'll start the timing.
Hi. First of all, thank you for allowing me to speak. And then another opening statement. I'd like to say a few words about the history of Maidenhead Golf Course. The golf course was offered for sale by auction in 1953. At the auction, a successful bid of £12,100 was made by the Mayor of Maidenhead, Councillor T.A. Stutchbury, acting privately with two friends. He explained to the Maidenhead Borough Council that they had done this to prevent the land falling into the wrong hands of those less concerned about the future than the local people were. He advised Maidenhead Council, if they wished, they could buy the land for the purchase price of £12,100, which they did with the view that this land would remain protected as an open space in perpetuity. Maidenhead Town Council clearly recognised the importance of the golf course site to the community when they purchased it in 1953. It is sad that their good intentions have been ignored by the Royal Borough Council. People need access to open green spaces since they provide both physical and mental health benefits. And the preservation of ancient woodland should be a major priority at a time when, as a nation, we are trying to lower our carbon footprint. It is also relevant to note that 4,500 residents also recognised this when they signed a petition in the early 20s supporting the proposal to turn the golf course into a park,
1 minute
Maidenhead Great Park. These are the local people that Councillor Stutchbury was referring to when he purchased the golf course in 1953. I would respectfully remind councillors that unfairly, more than 70% of new homes being built in the Royal Borough are in Maidenhead. Furthermore, the town centre is already dominated by high-rise flats, with more to come in the Nicholson Centre. When the council first announced the plans for these high-rise buildings, there was public outcry, objections and complaints. The council responded in the Maidenhead Advertiser, stating that they had gone high to save the green belt. So why is the council proposing such a huge development on the golf course? Furthermore,
Mr. Midgley, we've gone well over time. If you can just wind up, please.
Okay, final paragraph. Furthermore, has the council fully considered the impact on Maidenhead of adding a development the size of a large village on the golf course, together with all the other massive development in the town centre. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. For information for public speakers, we are taking notes of the points you're bringing up, and we will respond at the end of the public speaking part, so it doesn't get lost in the rest of the meeting. For the applicants, we have the owner Hanifi. Is it Hanifi or Hanifi? Hanifi, right. Same rules, but you have 9 minutes for sacrificing the extra time to the other groups.
Lovely. Thank you, Chair. Good evening, Chair and members of the Development Management Committee. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to address you on behalf of the applicant, Cala Homes. It is a privilege to be able to speak to you this evening in support of this development and to highlight to you the significant benefits this proposal will deliver for Maidenhead. We welcome the detailed and balanced committee report prepared by your officers, which confirms that the proposed development accords with the policies contained within the Borough Local Plan and recommends approval. We acknowledge the concerns raised by some members of the community to this application. We fully appreciate that change, particularly on this scale, can be challenging, and we do not take these concerns lightly. However, we firmly believe that this development will bring significant benefits to Maidenhead, delivering much needed homes, infrastructure and opportunities for the people of Windsor and Maidenhead. Also, I would highlight that from our public consultation events, we met many local people in support of the proposals, with many welcoming the need for family homes and increased local facilities. By way of context, in the preparation of the planning application, we worked closely with many stakeholders, including the council, the education authority, design review panels, and the local community. Cala have always sought to be open and collaborative with the stakeholders. This has resulted in the proposal evolving significantly over time to address local concerns. This outline planning application has been many years in the making. This builds upon the allocation in the adopted Borough Local Plan, following an independent examination by the Planning Inspectorate. The application before you this evening, in many respects, simply reaffirms the allocation in the Borough Local Plan, as this is an outline planning application only, with all matters reserved, except for the 3 points of access, as shown in the planning officer's presentation. What this means is that further planning applications concerning appearance, landscape, layout, scale, internal roads, pedestrian cycle paths will all need to be brought back to the planning authority for determination. The proposal fully complies with the policies in the BLP. In such instances, the National Planning Policy Framework is clear. There is a presumption in favour of sustainable development, which requires local authorities to approve the development unless material considerations indicate otherwise. In this instance, there are no material considerations that indicate otherwise. In fact, on the contrary, the council can no longer demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply, which further compounds the presumption in favour of sustainable development, where the default position on applications must be to approve unless the harms are so significant and demonstrable in nature. Moreover, this site forms the cornerstone of the Borough Local Plan in terms of housing delivery and infrastructure. If this site does not come forward, it will require this housing to be provided elsewhere in the borough. The housing need simply does not go away. Rather, housing requirements are ever increasing. Now, I would like to highlight 5 key benefits that this development will bring. The first one is a variety of homes and house types. The application provides for up to 450 affordable homes, in a range of sizes delivered across the site, along with more than 50 self and custom built homes, and an applicant who is committed to progressing with delivery once all the planning requirements have been satisfied and conditions discharged. While housing is a key element of this proposal, the application provides much more than simply housing. Which brings me to my next key benefit, that is the delivery of much needed local services. This application will deliver land for a 4-form entry primary school and a 7-form entry secondary school, a health facility of almost 1,000 square metres, a new local centre with shops and services, along with localised commercial uses, community uses, in addition to workspaces delivered throughout the site. The full details of the design of these facilities will be established through the reserved matters applications. The third benefit relates to green infrastructure and public access. The site is currently a private golf club with one public right-of-way through it. Just one footpath where the community have the right to walk through. This application provides for more than 20 hectares of public open space and green links. That's more than 1/3 of the site. At the centre of the site will be a major destination play space with recreation and play opportunities for all. This, in addition to the playgrounds, pocket parks, green trails spread across the site. Play and open space is a major feature in the design of this proposal. Moreover, the proposal provides for 10% biodiversity net gain through on-site and off-site measures. And the proposal is centred around a green spine where the priority is on pedestrians and cyclists along with public transport. This is a truly landscape-led proposal, which retains the most important ecological attributes and enhances the landscape value. And finally, on the topic of green infrastructure, the proposal will ensure the protection of Rushington Copse ancient woodland. The fourth benefit relates to economic investment and growth. This proposal will generate in excess of £35 million in terms of SIL and Section 106 payments, which will support the delivery of local infrastructure within the borough. The construction phase alone will support more than 160 jobs within the local and wider economy. And then once completed, the development will create in the order of 290 jobs through the schools, local services, retail and community facilities. And the final benefit relates to sustainability and climate ambitions. This project has been designed to meet modern sustainability standards, supporting the Council's long-term climate goals, which include modern methods of construction. Any houses built by Cala Homes will be timber frame, inclusion of renewable technology, and all homes will be electric, so it's a gas-free development. There will be 100% electric vehicle charging points, and all homes will comply with Cala's urban wildlife strategy, which would comprise an integrated bat box, bird nesting brick, invertebrate brick, hedgehog holes, and native trees in each backyard. So in conclusion, I would flag that Cala are committed to working collaboratively with the council and the community to ensure this development is a success for both existing and future residents. We believe this project represents a once-in-a-generation opportunity to create a sustainable, inclusive and thriving neighbourhood that enhances Maidenhead's future. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. We now move on to ward councillors or councillors putting forward their point of view. 3 minutes each. Councillor Gert Singh is the first to step forward, please. Same rules apply. When you're ready to speak, 3 minutes and you'll get a 1 minute one. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Committee members, I strongly oppose this development at Maidenhead Golf Course. This isn't just a bad plan. It should never have been in the borough local plan at all. Building up to 1,500 homes here is a disaster waiting to happen. Our roads, public transport, GP surgeries and local services are already at breaking point. Adding thousands more residents without guaranteed infrastructure upgrades is reckless. Traffic will grind to a halt, healthcare waits will soar and public services will suffer. Then there's the environmental cost. This golf course is a vital green lung, home to mature trees, wildlife, and much needed breathing space for our communities. Bulldozing it is irreversible damage at a time when we should be protecting it, not destroying our natural spaces. Let's not forget broken promises under the previous Conservative administration. We were assured community space and millions of council from the Magnet redevelopment site. Yet we've been left with a fraction of what was pledged and no community space on that site at all, despite it being allocated within the borough local plan. How can we trust that history won't repeat itself? Access via Shoppenhangers Road and Harvest Hill is another disaster in the making. These roads can't handle the extra traffic, leading to gridlock, safety risks and chaos for our residents. This development is not what Maidenhead needs. It was a mistake to allocate this site in the first place, a mistake made by the previous Conservative-led council, and it's an even bigger mistake to approve it now. We need homes in the right places with the right infrastructure, not empty promises and unsustainable plans.
1 minute remaining.
This plan is wrong for Maidenhead, wrong for the residents, wrong for the future. I urge the committee to scrap it now before it's too late. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Singh. Next, we have joining virtually, I believe, Councillor Martin. As soon as you're ready to go, and the 3-minute rule applies to you with the 1-minute warning. On you go, Councillor Martin.
Thank you, Chair. I usually chair this meeting, but I'm unable to today due to being predetermined as I have actively campaigned against this development. A key reason for me to deciding to run for election in 2023 was my dissatisfaction with the BLP and the way swathes of Greenbelt were recklessly removed across our borough, resulting in the mass housing developments that come through this committee month after month. Once land has been taken out of the Greenbelt and allocated for housing, it's near to impossible to give good planning reasons to turn applications down. A good example being Spencer's Farm, as although we were reasonable in our decision at the panel, we still sadly lost at appeal. This brings me on to the golf course development we have before us today. Maidenhead Golf Course occupies 132 acres of green open space, almost half of which is woodland, including several acres of ancient woodland. Since the pandemic, we all realise that outside space is vital for our physical and mental well-being. Green space and trees are essential for our environment, not only from a well-being perspective, but also for environmental reasons by absorbing carbon, oxygenating our air and supporting biodiversity. A climate and environmental emergency was declared in June 2019, with the Royal Borough committing to achieving a target of net zero carbon across the Royal Borough by 2050 at the latest to address the biodiversity crisis. Developing on Maidenhead Golf Course and other previous Greenbelt sites which have since been allocated for development within the BLP seems to sit at odds with us being able to achieve this target. Originally, this proposal, part of AL13 as referred to within the BLP, was for over 2,000 homes. I'm pleased that the current administration has managed to ameliorate that by some means by reducing the proposal down to 1,500 homes max, reducing building heights and increasing buffer distances between ancient woodland and the new development. I still worry, though, if an application has a host of conditions attached to it, then it makes you wonder if it's really fit for purpose. It's trying to smash a square peg into a round hole, which we seem to be doing with many BLP allocators. We find ourselves in a heartbreaking situation. The panel has a very difficult decision to make tonight, but I know you will consider all angles and come to the right decision. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Councillor Martin. Can we now call Councillor Hill forward to speak, please? guessing you need no brief. I think you know what you're doing.
How many minutes have I got, Chairman? Is it 2?
3 minutes.
It's
sorry.
3. Okay.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. I'll be brief. It's all been said. Go. Thank you for calling me to speak, Chairman. Like my fellow councillor Singh, this site really shouldn't be in the borough local plan. It should never have been put in. It was effectively there to pay down debts, raise hundreds of millions of pounds to keep previous administrations in power. That is not a good basis to start planning on or build homes. The key difficulty with this site, as I see it, with my highways brief for the Cabinet, is that it will result in a massive amount of unwelcome congestion on the surrounding roads. We've already heard about storage in the leisure centre. We know about the traffic jams on Shoppenhangers Road and also on the Braywick Road. Harvest Hill is too small. There'll be 7 junctions on Harvest Hill, which is an outrage. There's electric charging points across the whole site. That's a complete misnomer. Electric cars produce particulate matter 2.5 and I think 1.10, which is very damaging to health. So that's because they're so heavy. So you don't get rid of all the pollution. In fact, these things lodge in the brains of the unborn fetus. It's a disaster. Everybody, in terms of car movements, there'll probably be something in the region of 3,000 a day with 1,500 homes. The roads simply can't stand it. When it comes to pollution, trees mop up pollution. We're going to lose a lot of trees and they produce the air that we breathe. It makes no sense to introduce more pollution and cut down trees. That just doesn't work. In terms of services, we've seen the highway collapse on Shoppenhangers Road twice, I think, in the last 3 years. There isn't these necessary services and Thames Water will struggle. They're struggling at the moment to deliver literally the foul drainage from the site. We'll say no more on that. So to conclude, because I'm slowly running out of...
1 minute remaining.
Thank you very much. I'm slowly running out of time. The reason to overturn this is the infrastructure is inadequate. There's been objections from the District Highways Authority and Active Travel England. Certainly I would object on principle to it. We have schools nearby. We're going to have our young children suffer. Their lungs will suffer as they're developing. And people won't be able to get to work very easily either. We're set in traffic jams. And of course, we'll cut down the very things that suck up the pollution and produce the air that we breathe, those being the trees, and not to mention the displacement of wildlife, which has a right to live as well as everybody else. It should be left as an open park for the public to enjoy. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Hill. And our last councillor speaker tonight is Councillor Reeve.
Okay. I shall try and do it in 3 minutes, so I might speak rather quickly, but hopefully clearly for you. Okay. In the nearly 2 years of being a planning panel member, I pride myself on the independence of thought and being open to consider all views and balance them against the policies. This is why, regrettably, I had to step down from the panel for this application. I have been openly expressive about my opinion of the development of the golf course and could not, with good conscience, come to the panel with an open and unpredetermined mindset. Openness is key, or the lack of it, I should say. I agree wholeheartedly. Yes, we need more affordable homes, truly affordable homes, social rent and social purchase, not 80% of a high market rate already. But this planned site will simply hem in and stack the residents without any close access to open space to breathe. The promotional materials for this development should come with a tarred picture of our green lung of Maidenhead, similar to those on the cigarette packets. I have expressed major concerns about the lack of wastewater provision from Thames Water to be able to cope with this large development. And this informed part of my letter that I sent to the CEO of Thames Water to call them in before me and the other panel members of the Overview and Scrutiny panel for which I chair. Thames Water have also expressed significant concerns of the same. And I feel that I still do not have concrete evidence of this investment being sufficient to provide the adequate drainage and wastewater management for such a large site. Only 3 days ago, they discharged for over an hour and on average 74 hours of waste dumped per year into the cut that flows through Cox Green via Ockwells Park and towards the AL13 development site. Thames Water have borrowings in excess of £15 billion and are coming cap in hand to be rescued. And we are reliant on them to provide a sustainable wastewater removal from this site, with all its challenges and the proximity to flooding. If this development is to go ahead, then we should not have a condition of non-occupancy, but that they should not go above slab level without the completion of the required wastewater services to this site, so that we can trust that it can be done. We've talked about tilted balance and we've heard about it, but the targets are being sent simply down to local councils without being open to consideration for the local settings. This is a stick, not a carrot to build. You're being asked to, under the building heights parameter plan to agree what is not sustainable or openness to build 5- and 6-story buildings in an area surrounded by 2- and 3-story buildings and so close to an ancient woodland as it overshadows it. We know through studies that if you're not provided with sufficient access to open spaces and nature, it's detrimental to your long-term impact on mental health. Though this development is critical, this critical openness is being removed from our town. It is great that Rushington Copse is being maintained within the outline plans, but there seems to be a token open space and the green spine and corridors are pitiful options for maintaining a wildlife corridor, with the expectation that woodland creatures would need to negotiate the outside thin ribbon of land around the residential properties, which over time would just simply result in a shell of a copse. Woodland Trust, it's the last sentence.
Last bit.
Okay, thank you. Woodland Trust have stated clearly major concern and that a 50-metre buffer must be planted before construction to avoid deterioration of this crucial ancient woodland. But under the section 10.208 of this plan that's been put before you and criteria 7 of the pro forma, it does not state this distance, and this should be absolutely clear as part of the pro forma criteria. We should not leave it up to be obscure and not have a defined barrier to that woodland. It will be too late when they start building. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we've let everybody have their say and given enough time for that. And I do thank you for people to come along and speaking tonight, because I know it can be quite frightening in front of this rather intimidating room. So I do thank everybody for sharing their opinions. I want to ask briefly before we move on to the next part, for officers, if they can maybe address some of these points, particularly around the traffic and traffic loading. We've got Mr. Chris Joyce here, who highways falls under the remit, specifically for this person. So Chris, have you got any comments to make about the points that were brought up?
Thank you, Chair. So obviously, as part of the application, the applicant has put together a transport assessment. But as James indicated, the council has also undertaken its own work in terms of a transport assessment. Firstly, at the borough local plan stage, to undertake an understanding of how the entirety of the borough local plan could come forward, what transport mitigation would be needed in terms of improvements to junctions, and to assess whether that mitigation would be adequate. So as part of that work, the council identified 10 junctions across Maidenhead that would need to be improved to accommodate the growth that was required as a result of the housing and employment sites that were coming forward. 5 of those junctions have been delivered as part of the Maidenhead Housing Sites Enabling Project that was part funded by the Local Enterprise Partnership. A further 5 are then picked up in the SBD for South West Maidenhead, which sets out a plan how they will be funded and delivered, and sets out that mitigation plan. We also undertook a revised assessment at the stage of developing the evidence for the South West Maidenhead SPD, with updated traffic forecasts as a result of the emerging plans in terms of the details. That reinforced the same junctions that need to be improved. Those have all been costed and built into the plans that are set out in the South West Maidenhead SPD. As I said, those have been costed. We've considered the SIL income that would be generated by the developments across the South West Maidenhead SPD area. So that's AL13 and AL14 in their entirety. The Section 106 contributions that would be needed to come forward to fund that infrastructure. And that's what's informed what we describe in the SPD as the simple approach, where developers can come forward and effectively pay their fair share of that contribution to deliver the infrastructure, or they can undertake the complex method, which effectively means they have to do their own site-specific assessments of the infrastructure requirements and calculate their own approach to funding infrastructure. For this application, they've chosen the simple approach, and therefore they're providing funding, both in terms of SIL and Section 106, that funds their fair proportion of the infrastructure required for the entirety of the site. I would just flag, I know that a few concerns have been raised about some of the trip rates and assessments that have been undertaken by the applicant. Actually, the council's own assessment used higher trip rates, so higher levels of traffic, to understand the impacts of the development, which were 50% higher than set out in the application. Our own assessment demonstrates that the mitigation being put forward in the South West Maidenhead SPD would mitigate the impact of the development and not result in serious harm.
There was a point Mr. Hill brought out about the traffic data that was being used for the assessments being outdated.
So the traffic data was based upon the modelling that was undertaken at the borough local plan stage, which was based on the 2016 base year and then forecasted forward to 2033. Both in terms of our own recent work and the work that was done as part of the application by the applicant has actually demonstrated that peak hour flows, particularly at some of the most critical junctions, are actually lower in the current base year than they were in the historic base year. So we've seen changes to traffic patterns post-COVID, which means that whilst traffic across the day has come back to levels pre-COVID, actually at some of the key junctions, the peak hour traffic is actually lower. And therefore, if we were to build the models now, we might actually see lower levels of impact than we would have done from the borough local plan stage of assessment and the South West Maidenhead stage of assessment. Obviously, so from that perspective, we believe that we've undertaken what we describe as a sort of robust, reasonable worst case to ensure that we've got confidence that the development can come forward and be mitigated.
Thank you, Mr. Joyce. We've got some questions probably James can address. There was a lot around the ancient woodland, protections of it, the buffer and things like this. Have you got some information in the middle of there that you'd like to share about that?
Yes, I would refer members to the land use plan, the parcel plan, which denotes Rushington Copse, which is the ancient wooden buffer. That quite clearly shows around there that there's no, I say, built development, residential development shown on that plan. So by virtue of that land use plan, there's a buffer established anyway.
There was also, I think as well, a study about the loss of habitat, whether that had been carried out at all on the whole site as a whole.
Yeah, so there's been a phase 1 survey submitted for the application, which is the standard breadth of surveys that we normally expect at this stage. Like I said in my presentation, there's the conditions set out within the draft recommendation to request further surveys to go through the process. And like I say, it's not because we don't have enough information to conclude on that point now. It's just solely to give further comfort about unknowns in the future. So that's been assessed by our council's ecologist. They are happy with that and will always take their advice on these matters.
Thank you, James and Chris. We now move on to the next part of the meeting, and we're going to split this slightly for ease. And the first part, I'm going to ask the panel members to put questions to officers. and not so much to debate and put your opinion about at this stage. Then once we've all had a chance to ask questions and to clarify any points we may have, then to move on to the debate. But first, we're going to have a short comfort break, I think, just for 5 minutes. They'll be back here at 7 minutes past 8, if that's okay. So it's been quite a long time to sit here, so I think it's a sensible thing.
I've just said it. Yeah. Basically, publish the agenda regardless if it's following.
Ladies and gentlemen, if we can get ready to carry on. Hello and welcome back to the Maidenhead Development Management Committee meeting, considering the matter of the outline application, Maidenhead Golf Course, Shoppenhangers Road in Maidenhead, SO6 2PZ. If you join us online on YouTube, we just had a break and we've come back to the second part of the meeting. This part now will be a portion where the voting members of the panel, can ask questions or raise any issues they wish to bring up with the officers present. Once we've all had a chance to ask these questions or points of clarification, we will then move on to the debate part. So try and keep the questions in the first part and then allow us to have a debate in the second part, please. So the floor is now open for questions. If people would like to proceed, our first speaker is Councillor Devon Davis.
Thank you, Chair. I'll start us off with something hopefully not too difficult. My question is query is about the larger housing in the centre west of the application. It seems at odds with the Borough Local Plan and South West Maidenhead Development Framework Supplementary Planning Policy, which I'm going to call SPD from now on. The BLP, Borough Local Plan, that is, expects building heights to reflect the surroundings, with the north being at the tallest. Residential areas reducing in density from the local centres, and the SPD alludes to less housing in the centre. So what is the rationale for the larger, in terms of height, housing in the centre west?
I think that's yours, James.
So I'm going to struggle to tell you what the rationale is. I'm obviously not the applicant, should we say, but I can tell you about acceptability and how we'd assess it. I think that might answer the question, hopefully. But obviously, you've got on the building heights parameter plan up to 3 stories. And what I would stress, like I took you through in the presentation, is that it's a maximum. So say, for example, if a reserve matters application comes in and there's a reason why 3 stories doesn't work, and that's taking into account all the policies in the local plan, etc., the SPD, then obviously we could approve lower than that. So it's not saying like it has to be 3 stories. It's that's the maximum that you could go to, above which in principle this would be unacceptable. But again, it doesn't stop us from coming back down from those heights basically at a later date through the reserve matters process.
If I may follow up, I was actually referring to the up to 5 stories ones near the cut across. And also in your slide about parcel plan, it's just a priority for decision takers to ensure that any parameter plans approved now reflect the placemaking principles in the BLP. There isn't a similar paragraph on the height plan, but presumably we are to apply some weight to this height plan deviating from the BLP.
James.
I don't like to ask questions back, so I'm saying I just want to clarify the question. But are you talking about the consistency with the BLP policies or the SPD policies? Because it's a slightly different answer depending on which.
I was referring to both really. The BLP spells out more specifically that the build heights reflect surroundings and the residential areas reducing density away from the local centres, whereas the SPD more alludes to less housing in the centre. There's an illustrative diagram.
Yeah. So I hope this answers the question, but the rationale around the up to 5 stories, and I'll always caveat that's up to 5 stories, it's not 5 stories absolutely, is the area that surrounds the open space. So I would imagine the rationale behind that and why officers have deemed it to be acceptable is that that's an area that would become a placemaking feature. So it would enable a placemaking feature subject to acceptable design. I always say subject to acceptable design that comes forward to be facilitated in that area. So what you normally don't want to be seeing in terms of design intent, etc., is flat roof lines. You want to see punctuations in roof lines. And it's what we call like landmark and focal buildings. So these are things that we need to flesh out in the detailed reserve matters applications. But that's why we look at a up to 5 stories, because it gives an opportunity to create that. But again, if the design's not correct or what have you at the reserve matter stage, that doesn't mean that 5 stories is an absolute yes, basically. So, but it gives an opportunity to deliver those placemaking aspirations.
Thank you very much indeed. Councillor Jodie Grove.
Thank you. Chris, this is probably one for you. Appreciate you've answered some questions already on the modelling. However, Mr. Hill mentioned in his speech around the overcapacity around the Braywick Leisure Centre, and that in the Carla Holmes report, they have stated or accepted that there would be a need to hold cars in the leisure centre car park. Obviously, that does not sound good. And I do agree that that sounds like it would be significant and demonstrable harm to the local area. So I'd like your thoughts on that. And also £40.7 million funding gap for road improvements was mentioned. So I'd just like some intel from you on that one as well, please.
Mr. Joyce.
Thank you, Councillor Grove. So the point that was being made was that what the highest maximum RFC, which is the ratio of load to capacity, would be over 1 on the busiest arm during the peak hour. So that's a very specific thing. And also it's just really important to separate out the operation of the junction and the impact of the development. So that overcapacity arm on the junction is a result of all of the borough local plan development. And actually, if you look at the baseline scenario, i.e. with no junction improvements, the ratio of flow capacity goes up to 2. So what we're saying is the background growth as a result of the development, of all the development across the borough local plan would make that junction completely over capacity. The impact of the development itself is actually a very small proportion of that. But the mitigation that's coming forward as part of the development, i.e. across South West Maidenhead, the delivery of the gyratory will bring that down in the busiest period on the busiest arm to pretty much close to capacity. So the development traffic is not creating that impact. That is the impact in the entirety of the local plan. And if you think about the kind of scale of the impact of this particular development, the mitigation that the AL13 site and AL14 sites will bring forward has a much bigger impact in terms of improving the traffic situation than the development has in terms of making that worse. So I think it was in that situation, the development has mitigated its impact. In fact, it's mitigated some much bigger, wider impacts of the borough local plan through the investment that we'll get from in terms of infrastructure. In terms of the funding gap, I think that's a slight misunderstanding. In terms of we've identified the cumulative impact of development across the borough local plan, and the development is providing effectively its fair share of infrastructure funding, but clearly there will be funding from other sources as well. So the SPD identifies that, for example, the healthcare facility would come forward with some NHS funding. Improvements to junction 8-9, some funding would need to come forward from National Highways, recognising that the development doesn't fund the entire junction improvement at junction 8-9 because the requirement comes from a wide range of impacts, including National Highways' own sort of growth on their network. So I think we have to separate out how the junction operates in terms of with all of the borough local plan traffic versus the individual development impact, and also in terms of the mitigation that the development's bringing forward.
I'll ask a follow-up, is that okay?
Certainly.
So can we surmise then from what you're saying that the statement that this related to this development, that cars will be stacked in the leisure centre and holding, that is highly unlikely to happen? It is only 20%? Is there any figures to give us reassurance since it has been mentioned?
So what we're saying is based upon the total traffic from all development from the local plan, there will be some queuing at that junction. But if we didn't bring forward the development and we didn't bring forward the mitigation, the traffic situation at that junction would be far worse. So that's the point that I'm making here. And it's the two tables on page 41 of the transport assessment that shows, so without improvement, we've got a 2033, do nothing without development. The max RFC is 1.5, so it's 50% over capacity. By the time that you've gone to the 2033 scenario with development and the mitigation in place, you're down to 97%. So the mitigation impact is 0.6.
Do we get a net
See what I
gain?
mean? Whereas the worsening of the junction operation as a result of development traffic being added is 0.12. So the mitigation is generating a lot more capacity than the development itself is adding.
Understood. Thank you.
And Councillor Mark Howard.
It's another question for Chris. It's expanding on that about the Braywick gyratory. I'm a little bit confused because in certain documents, it's talking about keeping an eye on the situation. However, listening to what you were saying there, it's happening. Is there a date and time when this update, which from what you're saying is so necessary, is going to happen? And has the money been found to do it? Because the other point which was mentioned, I think by Mr. Hill, was about funding. And there doesn't seem to be a complete package of funding in place to deliver these things at the moment.
Thank you, Councillor Howard. So that was why we undertook the work for the South West Maidenhead SPD. So rather than allowing individual developments to come forward in what is quite a significant package of development and assess their own infrastructure, the council's been proactive and set out what infrastructure is required to support both AL13 and AL14, and therefore has set out how the development in those areas will bring forward the funding to enable each of those schemes to come forward. It actually gives the council control to deliver it.
Yeah.
So in terms of this specific application, they are following the rules of the SPD. They are providing their fair share of contribution towards those measures. And it will be in the council's gift to then deliver those, utilising the funding that developers are providing both through SIL and Section 106.
You're saying that, but again, is there a date and time when this is likely to happen?
So again, at the moment, it depends on the pace at which development comes forward. The council will monitor the traffic situation. And in fact, as part of the Section 106, there is a monitoring contribution that's being proposed. So we will monitor, identify the trigger points at which these improvements will need to be made and bring them forward in the appropriate time. So I think it's a really important point here that I think James has made a number of times, that this is the outline application. We'll have those assessments package by package, reserve matter by reserve matter, to understand whether we're triggering the need for the infrastructure to come forward at that detailed stage as the individual reserve matters applications come forward.
I hear what you're saying. I understand what you're saying about keeping an eye on it. However, we're talking about 8 years ahead with the figures of 2033 when we're talking about the junction being completely overwhelmed at any rate. And it's not exactly a small piece of work which would need to be done. So I would be thinking that it would be having some sort of, and as you said, the word trigger point, there would be a trigger point which is already decided upon to say, yes, next year or 2 years' time, we go for this after a certain point of house building.
So that's an ongoing piece of work, because obviously this is a complex set of developments. I think we also need to separate out the cumulative impact compared to the consideration of this particular development coming forward in terms of burdening one development with all of the infrastructure requirements. And that's why we took the approach that we set out in South West Maidenhead SPD, is to look at that cumulative impact, look at the cumulative requirements for infrastructure, and it gives the council has full control over when it brings forward those improvements. I'd expect some of those to come forward in the short term. So, for example, from the list of the SPD, the Hollyport Road junction is currently in in design ready for delivery. We have been working with National Highways looking at the proposals for Braywick roundabout. So these things are in progress and will progress through our capital programme. But again, it will be for the council to be able to control that delivery plan based on funding coming forward.
Councillor Gosling.
Thank you. My question is about pollution. Has there been any assessment or survey done on the possibility of future pollution regarding the cars and electric charging points?
So there's two parts to your question: pollution and EV charging, isn't it? I want to make sure I answer the right question. So until we know the details of what's coming forward at the Reserve Matters application, it's very hard to know what we're looking at. Is the complete honest answer. It will be a consideration because there are policies in the local plan that we'd have to assess the development against, but we'd be looking at that anyway as part of the Reserve Matters as a point of detail. But in your reports, there is a air quality section set out within that. That refers back to the local plan stage and the assessments that have been undertaken at that stage. And that cumulatively looked at the entirety of the L13 allocation to the up to circa 2,600 units. And it deemed in principle, it wouldn't arise in air quality issues. So that's air quality pollution. Obviously, we'd re-look at that. Obviously, as the details come forward, because circumstances do change, but there's nothing in principle at this stage that would suggest that couldn't be acceptable when the Reserve Matters comes forward. Then moving on to the electric vehicle charging point, forgive the pun, but we've got a condition that we can use on permissions. We'd normally apply it at the Reserve Matters stage because it's a detailed matter for consideration, but we can apply it to the outline permission. It's not the end of the world. We would do that to ensure that all the residential properties are provided with an EV charging point. Our standard wording that we use on similar applications are for a minimum of 7 kilowatt chargers. That's normally capable of charging a car up overnight. But again, we can pick that up at the Reserve Matters application. We don't try to over-condition things at outline. We tend to pick that up. The other fail-safe to that as well is that building regs and Part S also kicks in, and that provides a mandatory requirement anyway, outside of the planning process, to provide an EV charging. But we often do put the condition on anyway, just as a belt and braces approach. So,
thank you.
Councillor Mark Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I'd just like to thank officers for their work in putting this application and the report together. Thank residents for their comments, the applicant for their comments, and also councillors for theirs. It's clearly a very significant application, and the consideration, sure, of all panel members is taken extremely seriously. I'd like to pick up a couple of points that a number of people raised. Firstly, on the affordable housing. We've got 30% in the proposals. Firstly, how secure is that? Is that an absolute minimum and locked in, legally binding? And secondly, in terms of the mix, the comments around, this is from an applicant's point of view, that this is to help, there will be provision to help young people get on the housing ladder. But I see that most of the affordable housing is actually rental. So what option is there to change that mix to actually encourage people to get on the housing ladder? Because I've heard the comment, but I'm not seeing it in the application.
James, if you could follow up.
Yep, so that would get picked up in the drafting of the legal agreement. And what we would normally find in there is the applicants will be required to submit an affordable housing schedule that will set out the 10-year mix within that, and that will be reviewed at the time. Now, I go back to my magic 10 years of the build-out period. It might not be 10 years, it could be more, it could be less. But obviously, needs will ebb and flow as we go through that process. So what we try not to do is set a specific mix here and now, because where we are in 2025 could be different in 2035. So we do that and we write that into the legal agreement, and then that gets picked up when the Reserve Matters come forward. So it's basically triggered at Reserve Matters, and then we look at the 30% provision within that relevant parcel, and then we look at the housing mix at that time. Obviously, the starting point is the housing mixes set out in the borough local plan and up-to-date guidance. But obviously, our housing officer does look at that because they're aware of what our housing needs are at that time. So we try to take a pragmatic view as to what the needs are, but the starting point will always be the borough local plan. So it would get, so the answer to hopefully to your question is it'll get picked up in the legal agreement.
Can I come back on that? Thank you. Can you just talk me through the process of the legal agreement then, when you say that? So who has, when is it done and who has input?
James?
Yeah, so
would you like to get that?
I'll go first, and I'm sure Laura will correct me if I'm wrong in anything that I say. So we're having a nervous breakdown over there watching me now talk about legal agreements. But so the 106 agreement would always be written up and finalised after the consent is granted. So we set out in the recommendation the heads of terms within the reports as to what that would achieve. And within that would be a standard, and it's a standard clause across the board that requires the applicants, when they submit a reserve matters application, to submit an affordable housing schedule, which sets out what the mix is, what the tenure mix is, where those properties are located. Then that gets reviewed by the housing officer, and they'll comment on the acceptability of it at that time. So again, that's intended to look at the up-to-date information at that time, but it's all triggered through the legal agreement. We can do it through condition, to be honest with you. I don't think it changes much. I'm not getting, Sarah's not shaking her head. So there's different ways, but it does get secured and tied up in the legal agreement. We normally do it through legal agreement.
And who has input? I'm thinking more from the
Would you like to add anything to that?
I was just going to add one extra thing, which is also just to confirm that the 30% affordable is also contained within the legal agreement as well. Just to reassure you on that point.
Yeah.
And sorry, your second question was?
Is who has input into that legal agreement? Is it just officers, or do members potentially have input? Is there, how is that process done?
It doesn't usually include members. James might correct me on that from a Windsor and Maidenhead point of view, but it's very unusual to include members in that process.
James? Or Adrian, you want to say?
So normally we wouldn't expect members to write the legal agreement. That'd probably be asking too much. But if there are certain obligations in there that you said, we want absolute certainty this is going to get into the agreement, so it's not missed, not that we would miss it, but just for that absolute peace of mind and comfort, then what we would normally ask you to do is make it a condition almost of any recommendation that you may or may not make. And then we can just make sure that is picked up. So we couldn't enter into that section 106 legal agreement without reflecting what members would ask for, basically.
Thank you. Jodie Grove again.
Thank you. So I think it's probably worthwhile mentioning at this point, because a number of residents and councillors referenced the fact that obviously this land was put into the BLP and that it was a historical decision which they disagree with. So I think it's probably worthwhile just having it reiterated that that is not what we're here to discuss this evening, and we are not here to define whether this land is fit for building on. That decision was made way back in 2022 and tested through the courts. But linked to that, I noted that a number of people questioned whether there was still an ability to do anything to turn areas of this land into part of a nature reserve, potentially have, through the ACV, the historical woodland owned by the ACV. And I was just wanting to ask the question around the possibility of that, of whether that is something that could be considered at this stage.
James?
I think we've got two questions there, haven't we? So hopefully I put this up for you. So the principle of development question, which is really, can we unwrap a local plan through an application? The answer is no. Obviously, the option is always to refuse an application, but that would be completely contradicting the allocation in the local plan. And also the local plan allocation would still stand at that stage anyway. So it doesn't go away. And obviously applications aren't a forum to unpick a local plan. As I took you through the PowerPoint presentation, it is an allocated site. Obviously, any approval of an outline permission obviously reiterates the principle of development. And we've gone through in both the report and the PowerPoint presentation the reasons why officers deemed that principle of development okay to be established. That's all based on the current up-to-date information. But it's definitely, if an application were refused, the local plan allocation would still remain, basically. So that doesn't change. In terms of can part of the site be used as a nature reserve? I don't mean to sound like a stuck record with my committee speeches, but again, it's not proposed as part of the application. We've got to consider what is before us tonight. So that's not on the tables. And that's just not there for consideration. The point about the asset of community value, again, that's a separate legal process about disposal of land. So again, that wouldn't implicate upon this part of the decision making. I think Adrian might have probably a bit more experience on this point. If that's okay, can I hand over to him?
Yes, I just thought I'd provide a bit of clarity. So the ACV listing recognised a number of things that happen on the site. One of them obviously being the fact that people can, if they join the golf course, participate in use of the open space because the membership is open to all, although they do have to join. That's really the enjoyment of public open space. And so the development does pick up on providing public open space, which actually would have greater accessibility to people because anyone will be able to access it. You don't have to join the golf course to do it. The other thing is some of the other community benefits that were picked up through that listing were some of the benefits that arise from people being able to use the golf course clubhouse, for example, as a community facility. So I just thought it was worth highlighting that the description of development that we're considering does include the provision of community facilities and does, for example, include schools, which quite often have school halls which are put open to similar types of community use and share their facilities because that's in the general benefit. So I do think there are community benefits that will come forward through the uses here that will have those benefits. I thought it might also be a good point just to mention that something I was thinking about following Ms. Quadrino speaking, which was about the ongoing protection of the ancient woodland. And just to say, I've been reflecting on that a bit while we've been speaking, and we were intending to put in the legal agreement provisions for the open space and the corresponding management of the open space in the legal agreement. And I can't see any reason why we couldn't include provision for the ongoing management of the ancient woodland in the legal agreement as well, just to recognise and make clear that we're covering that off. So we would include that in the legal agreement.
Thank you very much, Adrian. If I can ask a question before we go around second ones, it's a bit of a hypothetical one because with this site layout, I'm acutely aware that a lot of these sites get built on the part that's, developed for housing, and then we end up with the green open spaces. Is RBWM selling the disposal of the entire site to Carla, or just this part which is going to be built on and developed? And will then the rest of the site still remain in RBWM ownership? Because a lot of these, estates you develop, the green spaces end up reverting to the local authorities.
So, I mean, that's not a question I can actually answer tonight, and it's not a planning consideration. So obviously the property function of the council through its land agreements has to decide what it sells and how it deals with matters. What we have put in place as the planning authority is the provision we'd have in the legal agreement about the provision of and the management of the open space to ensure that there is provision and that it is managed in some way going into the future. But whether that's specifically under the control of RBWM, under a property management company, under some kind of charitable trust that's set up, we couldn't answer at this stage, but we can give you the comfort that it will be provided and it will be managed because of the things we've secured in the legal agreement.
Thank you. I think it's something to sort of investigate because it's a normal thing that happens. Thank you very much. Councillor Mark Howard.
Thank you. Just building on what Councillor Grove said about the, shall we say, the natural environment. We talked about biodiversity offset and some of that possibly being off-site. Can we expand on that and make sure that if it is off-site, that it's still inside the borough, still inside of Maidenhead, rather than, I don't know, protecting a bat colony in Shetland Islands or something similar? And then my second question would be regarding the junction down in the south onto Harvest Hill, which would link the schools onto Harvest Hill. I would love to understand the logic of why we would be pushing 1,000 secondary school kids potentially, when we've already said it in the statistics put forward in the plan, that more of those will be coming from outside of the immediate area and should be expected not to be walking, cycling to school. And we're putting them past the front of a primary school where the kids are expected to be coming basically from the site. It just seems to be that we're encouraging cars to drive past a primary school, create extra risk when there doesn't seem to be an obvious reason to do so.
I think James for the first part and Chris for the second part. So, James.
I'm glad you gave me the first question, not the second question. So just in respect of B&G, so it's absolutely normal for a site not to be able to provide 10% net gains, or what, depending on how it's done, so 10% or otherwise net gains on site. That is absolutely normal. That's covered under the Environment Act for applications post-mandatory, and obviously it's covered under policy for this application. There isn't anything requiring us or RBWM to have that land within our ownership. Our main thing is to ensure that B&G and enhancements are provided. The difficulty is, and this is where we've got to be very careful between local planning authority hat and council hat, etc., is that if we were to mandate, so I'll take this through as a hypothetical scenario, if you were to mandate land for B&G within our borough, that becomes a monitoring fee, and obviously from a probity perspective, a perception perspective, it would look like we're trying to favour land within our area. The regulations are set up in the way that they are set up that allows for areas outside of the borough. The reality is when developers go further away from the host site, so just take out boroughs list, further away from the host site, and they seek to get credits, it does cost them more. So there's a financial incentive by the way the system's set up to bring it closer to home, but we couldn't as a local authority mandate that because obviously there'd be a wealth of probity issues that came out of that. But that does meet with the tests, it does meet with the policy requirements, and not for the sites that do require mandatory B&G under the Environment Act, that also meets that. So it's very, very black and white. It's all conformity with regulations, but the answer is no, we can't require it to be within our borough. It's just worse for the applicant to do it. So
was that a bit for Chris and there something?
Just turn you off. You didn't. So Councillor Howard, thanks for that. I pick up the point that James made earlier. We're here to assess. I can't justify the application in itself because it's not our proposals, but we're here to make those judgments. In terms of the kind of detailed design, we'd have to be making sure as the reserve matters for both infrastructure and the individual school sites were coming forward, that we were making sure that there are safe routes to school for children to get there. So whilst, yes, there will be traffic on those roads, we would make sure that there were safe crossing points, and we'd expect the roads to be designed not to be car-centric, to be pedestrian and cycle friendly. So absolutely, I get the point that you're making, but the internal detailed design would be able to pick that up in terms of ensuring that children will be able to get to school safely. Obviously, we want to maximise the number who are coming by sustainable modes and minimise the number of car trips, but it would be absolutely essential at the reserve matters stage, and we wouldn't accept a proposal that came forward that wasn't safe for children getting to school.
Okay, Councillor Devon-Davis next.
Thank you, Chair. So we've heard that the loss of a golf club is acceptable because it did not pass a needs assessment. We've heard that loss of public open space, again, is acceptable because the test is not met. We've heard doubts over the traffic report, but our own council's report says that this is acceptable. I think I already know the answer to this, but I will ask mostly for the sake of our audience and people listening online. Are members allowed to doubt these tests and assessments, or do we have to take them as absolute truth?
James or Adrian?
So I think this all comes down to the way we have to approach planning matters in general, which is as a committee, when making a decision, you have to make your decisions based on evidence. And if there is an appeal or the like after a decision, then we have to back up the decision we have made based on evidence. Now, obviously, there are varying degrees of evidence and robustness. ranging from anecdotal evidence and observations to very detailed highways models, for example. So obviously members can doubt things, as members of the public can, and as officers do at times. We all have doubts about things, but the thing members have to do when bearing in mind whether they could refuse a development is think, can we evidence the harm, and can we evidence the reason for refusal? And I think that's particularly relevant in terms of the tilted balance we now have to apply because of that word demonstrable. And that really goes to evidence. You have to be able to demonstrate that there would be a harm arising from the development that is so significant that you should refuse it. And you have to bear in mind what's before you. Now, in this case, in most of the circumstances, well, almost all, you have reports from qualified parties, whether that be on the open space or the traffic. They're all reports which have been prepared by suitably qualified consultants with the relevant qualifications submitted by the applicant. They have then been assessed by various parties, whether that is the council's in-house teams of professional officers or whether it's the professional officers by consultees, etc., and also by the planning officers who, while they may not be specialists in, for example, transport assessments per se as their specialism, do have a good degree of knowledge of the planning system and what happens in these things. So the recommendation officers have put before you is based on all of that evidence. You can doubt it, you can put forward evidence of your own, but I would just say you have to be wary. If we do refuse an application, we have to be able to evidence the harm that we're referring to.
Can we have Councillor Mark Wilson next, please?
Thank you, Chair. I've got 3 points, actually. Just firstly, picking up the point around the management of open space and woodland. And I noted the residents' suggestion around having community ownership or community-led management of the open space and the ancient woodland. Is that something that is, firstly, is actually a feasible option, which I think it is from what's been said already, and secondly, is that something we could potentially tie into a legal agreement?
So I don't think we can go to the extent of dictating a specific management regime for the open space, but I think what we could do, as I mentioned earlier, through that provision in the legal agreement, we could have a scheme come back to the council for approval about the management of the open space. There are various forms that such a scheme could take or might be beneficial for various reasons, ranging from giving it to an existing charity or for organisation to manage, to setting up an organisation to manage, to, and I don't think it's appropriate for us to try and dictate one tonight, because each of those would have various benefits, cons, etc. But I think we can specify that there should be one in place and that we get to approve the details of it.
Yes, okay, thank you. So in that sense, the door is open for a solution that to be determined, but that is an option. Yeah, okay, thank you. Second point around the sort of the transport point. Some of you may know I'm a bit of a fan of active travel, and I always look at these plans for sort of the provision for safe cycling. And I've noted that there is reasonable provision within the green spine for that. But then looking at the junction plans, there's actually no segregated cycle lanes on the junction plan. So it feels like, somebody could cycle from within the development to the end, and then they're sort of thrown onto the roads. Which to me is quite unsatisfactory. I'm always looking for the infrastructure to invite cycling where you have a segregated space. So I don't know, could possibly Chris talk about whether there is opportunity in the 106 and the infrastructure plans to boost the cycling infrastructure outside the development?
Chris.
So thank you, Councillor Wilson. So absolutely, I think James put it up on in his slides in terms of the infrastructure that's set out in the SPD. So that includes funding through the Section 106 for a new segregated walking and cycling route along Harvest Hill Road. So investment in there. So connecting Harvest Hill Road up from east to west and connecting into the Green Spine. There will also be contributions towards LC WIP schemes, which is the local cycling and walking infrastructure plan. There's one of the primary routes within that is on Braywick Road. So effectively there would be an east-west route as part of the infrastructure plan along Harvest Hill Road. There'll be an east-west route across the site, across the middle of the site. And then there would also be a north-south route through the site, through the spine, and a new north-south route along Braywick Road as well, which the council will develop as part of its LC WIP plans. But it includes those contributions towards sustainable transport measures, including also improvements to bus services as well. And again, James highlighted the bus gate and the ability to potentially reroute buses through the site, thus maximising sustainable transport credentials and potential of the site.
Thank you. And just on that bus gate, just to be clear, that was in the middle of the site, I remember, and that would basically allow buses through, but not cars, presumably in a manner to be determined. Okay, thank you. Also, just on the sort of the wider transport, I know that in the BLP there was a bridge over the A308, which this site would kind of link to via another site, which is now gone. And it wasn't clear what the alternative was. The alternative was left as a bit ambiguous.
Okay, again, in the Southwest Maidenhead SPD, there was effectively a contribution that would come through the Triangle site, which is the AL14 site. The intention, we believe there's a better value for money and a better quality solution by having a connection effectively around on the route around the side in effect, but that's been developed. So rather than having a bridge, you would have a sustainable transport connection from the Triangle site up effectively to Braywick Road and through. So there would be a contribution from the Triangle site to enhance sustainable transport connections between AL14 and AL13. Right. But that's obviously for a separate future application to come forward. But that was reviewed in greater detail as part of the Southwest Maidenhead SPD, and that's set out.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Just final question, that's all right. Moving to the topic of water management, we've got two issues. Firstly, around the sort of I guess the rainfall and groundwater. I know that the site is generally not porous, was my interpretation. So there's no infiltration, i.e. water is going to be running off this. And so there's going to be a lot of surface water to manage. And then secondly, around the wastewater, I think it's pretty well documented that in Maidenhead and across the borough, in fact, there are issues with sewage in various places and the capacity of the current Thames water infrastructure. I don't want to get onto conditions just yet, but can officers comment on the adequacy of the infrastructure at the moment? I'm picking up from the report that it is basically inadequate, and that we do need some action on that.
James, if you could answer.
So in terms of foul water, obviously the foul water network is governed by Thames Water, and obviously we're at committees a lot of our lives, and we hear the same obviously gripes about service providers, should we say. I don't want to get involved in the nuts and bolts of it all, but the reality is foul water drainage infrastructure off-site is dealt by the relevant bodies, and rightly or wrongly, as a local authority, we have to trust they will do the right job. And there's a separate set of enforceability that takes place outside of the planning process. So the main thing is, and I know you don't have an aspiration to talk about conditions just yet, but the main thing is that we're securing the right conditions to get to the connections at the right time. Obviously, then if different things happen off-site, that is very separate to the planning process and should be separate to your decision-taking tonight. But that's why we can deal with conditions up until this point, and then whatever happens thereafter goes from there. I noted drainage strategy on the site, but I didn't understand the question or follow the question.
It's effectively is the, or can you explain how it's adequate? Because on the face of it, it doesn't seem to be.
Yes, there's many ways of draining a site, and I'll just caveat this with I'm not a drainage expert at all, but the SUDS hierarchy promotes infiltration into the ground as a starting point. That's the best way of draining a site. But there's many sites around the country where the ground conditions underneath the land don't allow for that. And then you go down, you cascade down the drainage hierarchy, and then you look to alternative measures. So that's quite a normal approach. But the main thing is you look at those opportunities first. So that's why, and again, I'm very sorry to go to the conditions, but that's why we've put the condition on there, so that the applicants have to demonstrate why it doesn't work on those parcels in the first place to follow that hierarchy. And that's been specifically requested following the review by the lead local flood authority. So I wouldn't be in a position myself to take an alternative view in that regard, because I've got to listen to the experts and their comments.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Jodie Grove.
Thank you. Just to go back to the issue of impacted wildlife and nature on the site. Obviously, I know you talked through condition 11 and the fact that there will be updated ecological surveys at each, through the progress of each building. Sorry, it's getting late, my words aren't coming out. The building of each parcel of land. I didn't note anything about movement of existing wildlife during that building phase. There was nothing there, and I believe it was mentioned by a member of the public about a wildlife corridor or the ability to potentially move or relocate suitable wildlife from that environment. Is that something that I've missed? Is that something that we could potentially look at including?
No, it's something that we would pick up through that condition. So if species are found on a site, at the moment, we've got no reason to suggest there are irreplaceable habitats or irreplaceable species on the site. But if, for example, I don't know, let's just say, I'm talking hypothetically here, newts come into the site, and then it's probably a dirty word to use, isn't it? But say, like, for example, newts come onto the site and we realise they've got to translocate them, then we'd look to do that as part of that work. So that's why it's important to get the updated surveys at the relevant time, because things can change. We don't know they're going to change, they might not change. That's why it's important just to cover that off, just to make sure those eventualities are covered. So it's like an additional safeguard. And then the things like translocation of species, depending on what those species are, would be dealt with at that time in the same way they would be with any other application.
Thank you.
Councillor Kashmir Singh.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to first of all thank all our speakers, including councillors and the representative for Carla Holmes and our officers for producing a very comprehensive report. First of all, I've got two questions. If I can get an answer to those, then I may have a follow-up. First of all, according to NPPF 96, does the adverse harm of this development outweigh the benefits? And the second question I have is, according to NPPF 116, there seems to be insufficient analysis on the traffic and increased cumulative congestion.
Could you answer the second one first, Chris? Thank you.
So, as I set out in the kind of summary at the start, the applicant has undertaken a transport assessment that looks at the cumulative impact on the network and has undertaken their own assessment of the impact of their development on the network, and has brought forward a policy compliant mitigation proposal in line with what's set out in South West Maidenhead SPD. As I've explained, the council has also undertaken its own assessment, looking at the requirements for infrastructure mitigation, both for the South West Maidenhead development, but also for the borough local plan as a whole. And therefore, from an officer perspective, we're confident that the proposals that are being brought forward will mitigate the traffic impacts of the development. And that's based on the work that the applicant has done, but the work that we've done independently that has tested higher levels of traffic and demonstrated that mitigation will enable the traffic to continue to flow.
And James, for the other part of the question.
Just before I answer, I just want to clarify, is it paragraph 96? Because 96 of the framework talks about promoting healthy and safe communities. I think what you described might be, is it 11D? about balancing.
Yes, I was going to come up on the follow-up to that, NPPF 155D and 116.
155D, let me just, I'm going to actively scroll.
And that's regarding the cost-effective mitigation. And I wanted to also touch on the total amount of CIL was due to receive and also S106. Will it cover the funding gap for improvements, and what percentage will that be of the total cost?
Sorry, 155, did you say D, sorry?
Yes.
That talks about golden rules, but that's to do with essentially release of grey belt land, which this site wouldn't apply to.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So other councillors did touch on the fact of the CIL, which yourselves were talking about, NS 106. Will it cover all the cost, or what percentage of the improvements that we need for the junctions and the road improvements? Because the council is likely to receive that after a certain number of homes are built. We are already on the brink of bankruptcy, so we will have to borrow millions of pounds to make the improvements first, borrowing at commercial rates.
Thank you. Got an answer, James?
We're going to tag team on this answer. Yeah, I'll do the first part. I'll give it over to Chris for the second part. So just in terms of SIL receipts, Section 106 contribution. So obviously the application is submitted in outline nature. So until we know the reserve matters, and it's up to 1,500. So that could be, and I'm not saying it will be this, but it could be one dwelling up to 1,500. So there's a bit of flexibility in terms of how many units come forward. So that's why we can't tell you a definitive SIL figure now. And we can't tell you a definitive Section 106 figure, because that's all contingent upon how many units come forward. So we'll calculate that. I'll say figure out, so that's the wrong term, but we'll calculate that as the reserve matters come forward. And that will give a good indication then as to what the total figure would be. The other thing, just a caveat about how SIL is calculated, is it's always subject to indexation. So the later in the process, later in the development it gets paid, a new indexation rate gets applied, hence why I can't give you a figure now to say this is the total SIL bill. But obviously it will be liable to SIL when development comes forward and we know what the floor space looks like. And obviously will be subject to 106 depending on the unit numbers and floor space that comes forward as well at the same time. So that's how those systems operate in terms of permission. But I'll hand you over to Chris to pick up the second part.
Chris,
I was going to say, as I've said previously, the South West Maidenhead SPD sets out how the full package of infrastructure can be delivered through the receipts from the development. There will be some aspects where it's not directly related to development. Other forms of funding will come forward, as I explained, say for Junction 8-9 of the M4. There'll be funding that will need to come forward from National Highways if that's required. For the GP, there will be funding that might come forward from the NHS. But in terms of mitigating the transport impacts, those can be funded from the Section 1 SIL receipts across the AL13 and AL14 developments. In terms of your point around development infrastructure, the funding coming forward after development, so SIL becomes payable at commencement of development, not at occupation. There are different triggers also that we can set out in Section 106 about the timing of infrastructure payments as well. So it's not necessarily that we'll receive the money at a time at which there's then lots of houses occupied. And as I explained in the kind of broader context, for the entire borough local plan, we needed to deliver 10 junction improvements across that period. We've already delivered 5. We're going on site with the 6th one. So actually, we're bringing forward the required infrastructure in line with development, not afterwards. So actually, we've got a good track record in terms of doing that. So I hope that gives you the kind of confidence that we don't just get the money after the houses have been built. We get the money as the housing starts to be built and before it's occupied. So therefore, we can invest in these schemes ahead of that and therefore bring them forward appropriately.
Follow up on that? Just want to nail down the percentage, what the council is going to be paying for these improvements and how much the CIL and S106 is going to cover that. Because what we don't want to be in the situation is where there's that funding gap.
So, as I said, the funding, the infrastructure requirements for South West Maidenhead across AL13 and AL14 are fully funded from the SIL and Section 106 payments. So in terms of that mitigation, this, and again, I need to come back to this individual development. This individual development is providing its fair share of contribution towards that infrastructure. So there isn't a piece that we're saying that therefore there's a gap for the council to fund. This is the impacts of the development and the infrastructure required to accommodate the development is being funded out of that SIL and Section 106 pot.
Well, thank you for clarifying that. The reason I was coming back to that is the schools to be built on the site are going to have to be funded by the council, the primary and the secondary school. It's not the developer who's going to be building those, are they?
So again, that is on the list of the SIL and Section 106 funded schemes. So if you look at the table that James set out in his presentation, the table 7.
Figure 7.
Figure 7. So figure 7 sets out the things that we expect to fund from SIL and the things we expect to fund from Section 106. So the primary school, for example, we're expecting the majority of that demand, the vast majority of that demand, to come from the development sites themselves. So that will be funded through Section 106 contributions from developers, whereas the secondary school is more of a strategic need across the borough. About 50% of demand will be coming from this, the AL13 development, and therefore that's being funded out of SIL.
Okay, thank you very much.
And Councillor Mark Howard.
I was just a little confused by the answer on the cycling issue across. How are people going to get from this site to Braywick Leisure Centre? Because that was, I didn't quite understand the answer before.
Yes.
So as I tried to explain previously, so there's an east-west walking and cycling route identified across the site. So you would be able to move up the north-south green spine, along the east-west route in the centre of the site, and then you'd be able to come across Baywick Road using the crossing.
There's crossings, okay. And the other question I have is back to our lovely junction on Harvest Hill where the schools are. Spoken before about the numbers that of potential cars which are going in there at, shall we say, rush hour in the morning. And it did seem to be disproportionately low for the amount of kids. Now, I understand this has got, shall we say, gone through the model. The model says this is the answer. What I'm curious to know is how much extra capacity have we got in that junction if the model turns out to be wrong and a lot more kids in Maidenhead get delivered to school than, shall we say, the national average, which my point would be, having dropped my kids off at school by car, I would also say that a lot of other people do, and it's definitely more than 10%.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. So I certainly understand and recognise the concern. I think I'll pick up a general point and then a bit more on the detail. On a point of clarification, I think you're referring to table 6.3.
I think
so. In the transport assessment, that sets out the trips, but just to clarify, that's not the total expected car trip generation of the school sites. That's the ones that end up on the wider network taking off the internal trip. So the model itself does assume a higher level of traffic generation for the school itself. So I'll kind of pick it up in zones. So in terms of the immediate areas around the school, obviously at the reserve matter stage, as we design the school, we need to make sure that there's sufficient capacity and well-designed arrangements for pick up and drop off to accommodate the expected level of demand. So we would expect to pick that up at the reserve matter stage alongside some of the aspects that I think we picked up in terms of sort of safe routes to school and making sure that people can walk. Then the access to the development itself. So if you look at page 40 on the transport assessment, there's significant spare capacity in that primary access junction. So in the peak hours, that junction's operating the different arms between 20 and 30% of the total capacity. So therefore, if high levels of traffic were expected to and from the school, there is that ability to accommodate that. Obviously, we don't want more traffic, but there is capacity on the network to pick that up. And I think the third kind of zone of influence is that kind of wider impact on the network. So if more trips from the school are generated, obviously we might be concerned that we've underestimated the impact on the wider network. I suppose the reassurance there is, as part of our own assessments, as I've said before, we've tested traffic levels in terms of the residential traffic 50% higher. So in effect, we've tested that larger amount of traffic on the network. But in addition to the housing, also at the local plan stage, the AL14 site was tested as what we call B1 kind of office type development, rather than the probably more logistics or lower density employment uses that we'd actually expect. And therefore, compared to the more recent assessments based on what we think the expected use to be, we've effectively tested double the amount of traffic. So say on Braywick roundabout, when we consider that, that's another 600 to 700 more trips that we've tested through the network because of using office trip rates. So we're confident that even if there was a higher level of traffic generation from the school than forecasted in the transport assessment, we've got enough robustness in our own assessments that we'll be able to accommodate that traffic on the wider network, the immediate development network, and also to make sure that we can assess the reserve matters stage to make sure the individual site is designed appropriately to accommodate the right level of traffic.
Great, thank you.
James, you've got something to add to that as well.
Yeah, I just want to cover just a couple of, I guess, points of clarification about how we take decisions, et cetera, et cetera. I understand the concerns there raised by Councillor Howard, but I just want to be really, really clear just for members tonight that I appreciate concerns, natural concerns with what might happen, what could happen, what might happen in the future, which none of us know. So that's why we have to be really clear, like Adrian said earlier, about making decisions based upon the evidence that we do have. I think what might be helpful just to allay those concerns, you have to make your decision based upon the evidence that you've got before you. And obviously the consultee comments that have come out. But if things were to change, for example, and if things were to evolve, what would be the process we would go through as a local authority? So hypothetically, I don't like talking hypotheticals, but it gives you the comfort, hopefully, that, the school, when it comes forward as a reserve matters application, gets modelled, movements are much, much higher than we ever thought, and the modelling was completely far off, which I'm sure it's not. And further junction works were required, where we'd get the applicants at that point to go and revisit the junction requirements because it wouldn't pass the tests in the MPPF and the borough local plan to do that. I think it's highly unlikely that would be the case, but what I'm trying to get over to you is that there is a fail safe there, that we wouldn't be granting inappropriate development at the reserve matters stage if things did evolve for whatever reason. But it's important for you tonight to make your decisions based upon the evidence and the facts that you've got before you. Thank you.
And Councillor Mark Wilson, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just one further point on the school. On the two schools, and this, I guess, is more a consideration of need. I'm aware that at the moment, the borough's schools are looking at a slight decline in numbers in the short term. Appreciate this is very much the medium to long term. But looking at paragraphs 10, 78 and 79, it seems like we kind of go, there's an automatic trigger on the 500th dwelling for the primary and the 1000th dwelling for the secondary. Is there any mechanism to actually reassess need at that point and maybe tailor the need to what it is then, rather than how much flexibility is there around assessing? Like, for example, it may be actually a special needs school might be better, or just that flexibility, because it looks a bit kind of fixed.
James, if you've got something for that.
Yeah, so the reason why we haven't done that, and this has been a very specific and intentional reason, is that the local education authority have a requirement, a separate requirement, to meet the school places that are required in the borough at the time. So that's covered separately to the planning process. So we've got what we call a backstop position in terms of that trigger point, which is 500th for the primary, 1,000th for the secondary school. Now, if that comes forward earlier because the needs are there, then the local education authority have a statutory duty to meet the places within the borough at the time. The helpful thing is, and I try not to blur the lines between ownership and local authority, but the reality is there's a council-owned site with an outline planning application on it. So it's not like they're trying to find a new site earlier or anything like that, or availabilities of sites aren't there. That's all within the control of a public body. So that is, not to blur your lines, but I hope that gives you comfort, if that makes sense over that point.
Just to come back, sorry, I was actually also thinking of the alternative scenario that there isn't the demand, and therefore we want to reduce the education provision because it will simply be building a school that doesn't get used. I would say a bit of a doomsday scenario, but just looking for that flexibility. Is there the flexibility to go, well, actually, we don't need this much now, we need this much, and adapt it?
Yeah. Well, James, I think again, it's things we don't know, isn't it, really?
So
is there the flexibility to flex?
Yeah. Putting my kind of infrastructure, sort of broad infrastructure planning hat on, what the trigger says is an application to come in. It doesn't say exactly what needs to come forward in that reserved matters application, and it doesn't say that the council then needs to deliver all of that provision. All that does is give a trigger for the reserved matters application to come forward. So
there is,
yeah. So it doesn't then say that you have to then come forward with the full capacity and build out the school, but the reserve matters to give that, as James said, that certainty.
Yeah.
James?
Yeah, I think just following on from that as well, things can change. Obviously, they can change. None of us have a crystal ball, and I never advocate making planning decisions as a committee or even as an officer level or based upon the ifs of what's maybes, etc. But the reality is there are processes, systems in place that applicants these are all lawful systems. I'm just saying as a process to go through variations of legal agreements, variations of planning applications, etc. to look at that if that were to arise for whatever reason. But the one thing I would say is that as a rule of thumb, once you've got land safeguarded for education, the starting point is generally not to lose that land, basically. So there's always flexibility, like there is with, as a matter of fact, with any planning application, planning permission, there is flexibility. But I think it would be highly unlikely that we would revert back from that position when there's a safeguarded land for school. The reason why I say that is obviously just as a bit of context for this application. We've gone through the new MPPF, the new housing requirements, the tilted balance, etc. Housing requirements are growing within the borough. And when housing requirements grow, the needs that come with households, for example, education provision, grow as well. So again, I don't like ifs and buts, but it's probably going to be more of a need for a school moving forward than less of a need. But the systems and the framework, the legal framework is set up to allow for amendments. But if those amendments were made, we'd be coming back to the committee to put them in front of you because that's what our constitution requires.
Thank you, everybody. I think if we've exhausted the questions to the officers, we'll allow you to breathe now and relax, put your pen down for a few for the rest of the meeting, I think, unless something comes up. I'd like now to open the floor to members to debate and to discuss how they're thinking and move towards a decision at some point further down the line. It'd be ideal if everybody can have a say and contribute before we start moving to any kind of proposals or anything, just to give people a chance to read the room and air their views. So Devon Davis is first off the mark. Devon, off you go.
Yeah, well, I'm first alphabetically, so maybe I should go. So because of a recent update to the National Planning Policy Framework, paragraph 11D, we require significant and demonstrable harm to outweigh the benefits. We've really looked and we've asked for questions, but the evidence presented to us by the council's representatives and other testers have told us there is no demonstrable and significant harm. I understand the concerns with losing the green space in the golf club and it's a shame that this area was added to the borough local plan. But that is out of our control right now. It happened in the past. I think this is only going to be a foregone conclusion, and I'm going to have to approve this. We can try and mitigate any damages with conditions, but that's my thoughts right now. Hopefully, maybe someone can say something clever and change my mind.
Thank you, Jodie Grove. Councillor Jodie Grove. Sir.
Thank you. Yeah, so to kind of mirror what Councillor Davies has just said, and just to reassure residents, being on a planning panel like this is never easy. This is a situation where, if I'm being completely honest, if I had been in the council back when the BLP was formed, I would be fighting this tooth and nail, because my personal preference is always to keep green space. I, unlike some of our government members, do care about bats and newts, and nature means so much to me. The difficulty of being on this particular panel is that that ship has sailed. That decision was made. This land is in the BLP, whether we like it or not. I don't, but it is. This was challenged. It was taken up to the highest levels, and that challenge was not successful. So what we are dealing with here tonight is not whether this land should be built on, it's just whether this particular plan is suitable to meet those needs. You know, we are all, as has been referenced by various councillors, going to have concerns about the what ifs. Is the road infrastructure going to hold up? Is the sewer system going to hold up? Are there going to be enough kids in schools and all of these things? But as has been said numerous times this evening, we don't have a crystal ball. We've got to work with what's in front of us right now and base our decisions on the facts, on the evidence, and not, unfortunately, on our overall feelings about this particular plot of land. There are conditions that I would like to highlight that I've noted as we've gone along that I would like to see considered if possible, and I'll put those forwards now. So first of all, the ancient woodland. Within the plan, Carla have stated a buffer zone of 25 metres, which, as we have discussed, is above the lowest level, which is recommended. I would like to see a condition put in place to make sure that they do not drop that back down to the lowest minimum level. So a condition stating that it cannot be less than 25 metres. I'd also like to see, as we discussed a little while ago, strengthening of condition 11 for protection of wildlife identified, to clearly state in that condition about the relocation of any identified wildlife. And I would like a wildlife corridor to be looked at in more detail. I would also like to throw out there, it was obviously we've talked about Thames Water and the sewerage, of whether there can be a strengthened condition around the not above, building above slab level until they have fully investigated that infrastructure. I can't see how it is ever going to be feasible to even start building houses when we have had sinkholes on that particular piece of road. So they're the conditions that I wanted to put out for consideration. And I did want to say that I have heard every single resident, and I do feel in agreement about the shame of losing this green space, but removing the heart element from this, what I have heard this evening from officers, from the representative on behalf of the applicant, is that this will deliver much needed housing to the area. I'm really pleased to see the conditions and the strengthened conditions around the affordable housing, the addition of the schools, which I agree will be needed, and the health provision as well. So my head is that I haven't heard anything this evening that would constitute at a level for us to be able to refuse this application. Based on all the evidence that's been given, the tilted balance, nothing has come to my attention that is demonstrably significant and harmful. So that's where I am. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Grove. Can we just break quickly about those suggested conditions? Are they already in there in some shape or form, James, or could they be put forward at some point? If you keep a note of them, so if it comes through them, could you just repeat them again so James can make sure he's captured them?
Yeah, of course. So there was one condition around not allowing that buffer zone to be less than 25 metres around the ancient woodland. There was strengthening of condition 11 to specify the relocation of identified wildlife. and to look at the feasibility of a wildlife corridor. And then there was a condition around Thames Water and not building above slab level until it can be confirmed that the sewerage system is in a fit state.
If I can ask you, James, are they conditions we could add?
If I can just share my screen with you, I just want to talk you through, if that's okay. If I can click the right button.
Yeah.
Hopefully this will provide some. I never like to measure in public. This is never a good way of doing things. But that gap, so just in terms of the ancient wooden buffers, this is the dark green area here on the parcel plan. That gap between there is less than 25 metres. So imposing a condition of a blanket 25 metres would be in conflict with the parcel plan. But there obviously is scope around the other parts of it to achieve that kind of space. Equally, along the eastern boundary of the ancient woodland is hard up against the red line. So we could look to expand a buffer zone, which should seek to achieve 25 metres, but acknowledging the points that are like on the eastern boundary, for example, we can't do it because it's hard up against the boundary. Where the green spine comes in, we can't do it, but in all other areas where we can expand it, we could do that. So I think provided Sarah's not shaking her head at me and saying that doesn't work, then we could say we could phrase as should seek to achieve 25 metres, and we'll get 25 metres where we can, but where there's obviously clear pinch points, for example, the green spine and the and obviously where the eastern boundary, then obviously we'd have to reduce it down accordingly.
Maybe phrase it on, areas that are within the development. Because that would then keep it tight, if you like. What was the other one, Jody? I think the wildlife corridor and the relocation. Sorry, James.
11 to specify the relocation of identified wildlife and wildlife corridors. The only thing I need to be more clear on that is just in terms of what wildlife, because there's different levels of wildlife. There's obviously some wildlife that's just very normal and very commonplace that you wouldn't seek to protect. There's other ones that are. So I would need to just clarify that probably post-meeting, if that makes sense. And the recommendation as it's set out allows us to do that. So it'll be about getting that wording agreed. We could bring it back to chair, to be honest with you, just to clarify that anyway. And then the final one to do with Thames Water and requesting an earlier trigger point. At the moment, it's triggered prior to occupation. That's in accordance with Thames Water standard practice. Did you propose an earlier trigger? I can't.
It was.
Yeah.
Sorry. It was more to do with that not building above slab level until it has been confirmed that the sewerage system can bear the additional weight, as it were.
I think it's more having a plan, isn't it? Seeing the plan and how they're going to do it.
Yeah, I guess I still have a concern over the fact that there have been sinkholes on Harvest Hill Road, and what we have at the moment just does not feel strong enough to ensure that we're not going to have houses built and then say, oh, actually they can't be occupied for another 3 years while we update the whole sewerage system. I just think it needs to be strengthened.
Yeah, okay. So normally speaking, I'll tell you the context to it first before I answer the question, but normally speaking, developers will apply to Thames Water long before occupations to ascertain capacity in the network. I think there's a period of about 2 years before actually occupying units, so they can apply to Thames Water as a public body to achieve that capacity. So we could easily bring forward the condition to pre-commencement of that relevant parcel. That just means that before they start digging into the ground, they've got to have that capacity. The reality is the developers generally do have that confirmation beforehand, so it shouldn't be a problem. I would just need to obviously agree that with the applicants post-meeting prior to issuing the decision, but that should be perfectly fine.
Would that be better as a note rather than as a condition?
It's drafted as a condition at the moment, it is. So we'd secure it as a condition because that's a Thames Water request for a condition anyway. Okay. It's just changing the trigger point for it.
Okay, so we'll bear those in mind as we go forward. Councillor Gosling.
Thank you, Chair. I totally echo Councillor Grove's last comments. And I will refer back to the summary, which is the latest published 5-year housing land supply figure comprises 4.69 years. Therefore, the starting point for assessing the development is a presumption in favour of approving the development unless significant and demonstrable harms that are overriding in nature can be evidenced. No demonstrable harms have been evidenced. There is a housing crisis in the Royal Borough, indeed in the country, and this sustainable location adjacent to the railway station and the town centre will provide much needed new housing, including affordable housing, social infrastructure and enhanced public realm and access to give good homes to so many in need in our borough. The development is in accordance with the adopted borough local plan. As we all know, the development of this council-owned land will significantly improve the finances of the council. However, I do have some reservations. I have to say I'm not comfortable with the amount of flats, as Maidenhead has so many flats, and more proposed in the adjoining sites and in the Nicholson's Quarter. However, I am pleased to note the 2 schools and the community aspects, plus the open space, and I would like to see confirmation that the 2 schools will be built within a certain time frame. Thank you.
Next, we have Councillor Mark Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'd just like to obviously echo that this is a very tough decision. There's a lot of strong feeling, certainly from residents, councillors, but the legal bind that we're in, gives us very little sort of room to manoeuvre. What we can do is try and is build in conditions, and I think that's in progress. What I would say is that from the original plans, what is before us today is significantly better. So I want to recognise the work that's gone in over the last couple of years, to ameliorate what could have been. And that this is hopefully a reasonable compromise. On conditions, just on the traffic monitoring, which we've talked about, can we add some, is it possible to add a condition on traffic monitoring to tie in early and frequent monitoring so that we can respond to a situation rather than have a problem start and then it take a long time to resolve? So that would be one, traffic monitoring. Would completely echo the no development above slab level condition for Thames Water. We've had that on another development, so I hope that should be okay. And also in terms of the design code and the reserve matters, will they automatically come back to panel? Or because I think it would be good if they did come back to panel.
Adrian would probably be best placed here.
Generally not automatically under our constitution, but members can request that they come back to panel, and we were fully expecting that members would want that. So
yes, I think if we can add that, I think that would be appropriate, that each reserve matter comes back to panel given the public interest.
And Councillor Mark Howard.
Yes, I think we're in between a rock and a hard place. This is in the BLP. There is very little room for us to move out of this, except for we have to tighten up the restrictions. I echo the speaker who had little trust in the will or the ability of Thames Water to update the sewage network. And I think we've seen it in other sites around Maidenhead, notably AL37, that the condition on Thames Water was tightened substantially. And I echo the slab level condition that we're putting forward. I would also like to bring forward a few things about protecting the ancient woodland. I think is that the drainage scheme needs to be made sure that it is not overtly affecting the woodland. So the hydrology map has to basically not make things worse. The second thing was about the buffer around it. I saw the map and I understand what you're saying, but I agree, shall we say no building work around the buffer for 25 metres. So that allows the spine.
Storage of equipment.
Yeah, and it allows people to maintain their gardens. I think is that what we're trying to do is to just create a more substantial buffer than the bare legal minimum, especially as it's a site of interest. The second thing is that sometimes too much public access to a place of beauty is also a bad thing as well. So I think we need to look at how the community can take ownership and responsibility for managing the woodlands, and to manage them in the best interests of the woodlands, not necessarily the people. So I keep coming around to the fact on the traffic issue, I had severe reservations about the capacities of certain junctions, and I've been reassured about that. I'd be reassured even more if we had this constant monitoring on the core dozen or so junctions, and again, how traffic is directed off these sites towards the places it wants to go to. And I have a fear a little bit about how that will go through the centre of Maidenhead, and not a great worry about how it gets onto the motorway. So I think is that we need to make that traffic monitoring public, open, transparent, regular, and broad across the whole of the town, so that we can make sure that if there is a problem that no one can foresee, we don't have crystal balls, but we can put processes in place to try and catch issues, that we have the monitoring in place to find out and know what things are going wrong and to address them. So that's where my thoughts are going. So there's no one else. Over to you.
Thank you, Councillor Howard. There's a couple of points been made between Councillor Wilson and Councillor Howard about other little adjustments. Can we just explore them that could possibly be turned into either notes or conditions, or if maybe there are existing conditions that could be modified to especially the active traffic monitoring, I think is a really hot potato, and I think really does things. And Councillor Grove's suggestion about the 25-metre buffer, that modification built in the buffer then leaves the eastern boundary. And in a way, it kind of protects anybody developing their back garden close to the buffer maybe in the future. You know, is a sensible suggestion. Could those be achievable as conditions?
So the one thing we can't do through condition is condition or control land outside of the red line. So obviously where the woodland goes up to the red line on the eastern boundary, we couldn't control that. Basically, that's a matter of course, really. And the reality is if people do development in their back gardens that requires consent, we pick it up that way. Anyway, hopefully I've got some notes down here, so I do apologise if I missed anything. But I think Councillor Howard picked up on about no built development within the buffer zone that's been proposed by Councillor Grove around the ancient woodlands. Obviously, the purpose of a buffer zone is to ensure no built development. So I think that hopefully covers that point off by virtue of what it is. The way that I've suggested the conditions be worded would be requiring a buffer zone around Rushington Copse to provide a minimum 25-metre buffer where possible, excluding the eastern boundary of Rushington Copse and a boundary to the green spine. So that just means that where we've got pinch points and obviously where the parcel plans do show development, we can't do that. But everywhere else, we can expand that out because that's completely reasonable and meets the test. In terms of traffic monitoring, we've obviously got our recommendation, and which will be referred to in the Section 106 agreement about financial contributions towards monitoring of junctions. What we can do, we can crystallise that. I think probably the best way of doing it would be to, when the reserve matters applications come in, this would be probably a new condition. When the reserve matters applications come in, they'd be accompanied by a transport statement, which it would be anyway, because we need to monitor that. And that would need to refer to the monitoring work undertaken. So it means that we're tying the two together, because we can write in obligations to do regular monitoring, but that doesn't get you anywhere actually, unless you're using the monitoring in terms of the development coming forward. So that might be the best way of doing that. It's just saying that every reserve matters application is required to refer to the transport monitoring undertaken.
That be condition 1
Conditions always the strongest way it is, and then it means that we've got absolute certainty coming back from this. Adrian, have you got a disposition on this?
Not particularly. I had a slightly different, well, it was related, but the condition about the buffer zone, I was just going to suggest that rather than simply trying to in words specify 25 metres where possible, it might be better if we say, notwithstanding the approved plans, set out the requirement for a submission of a plan showing the buffer zone, that and then put in writing should be a minimum of 25 metres where possible, excluding the boundary. That just provides the ability for the applicant to put something on a plan that we can look at and see is workable. It also perhaps provides ability for greater granularity and discussion about what that plan might or might not show at a later stage, rather than trying to put hard words in it here and now.
It's been a long meeting, but you lost me right at the start. I think if we can percolate that down into a shorter statement, perhaps.
Yeah, I think we can narrow it down even further. So I think what we can do is put a condition on saying to submit details of a buffer zone pre-commencement of development. Then we've got all the information there that comes through in the public file. Obviously, all the councillors, Councillor Gray, that'll all be there for comment on, etc., etc. That's probably the best way of doing it. So do it as a condition of a buffer zone around the Rushington Copse, seeking to achieve 25 metres, notwithstanding the approved plans. Then we've got that as complete transparency. Then we don't trip ourselves up. So.
Okay, I agree with that. Mark Howard, sorry, Councillor Howard.
Yeah, sorry, is that going to give? I understand the need for flexibility. I understand the problem about the boundaries. However, I feel reluctant to just throw it sort of like we've got this far on this idea. I think is that nailing it down and making sure it happens is most important, because one of the main things which I've heard people say when they're speaking here is not just about the council, but about Thames Water, about all sorts of people, about trust of delivery. And I think is that if we trust, there seems to be a lack of trust in the room. So I think getting over that and nailing something down very firmly in black and white here is the way that I would be happier to proceed. I understand about the limiters, but just sending it away into the ether for a couple of people to go and have a think about and come back with a plan that may or may not come in front of these people again feels less than great.
I think it's worth making the point that Sarah wants to come in about the legal status of conditions. They are enforceable in law. It's a legal agreement.
Yeah, absolutely. The council would have discretion to enforce a planning condition in the event of a breach. So that would be the safeguard that the council has in place.
I thought the wording change to me sounded like we had something firm from James, and then we went to something where something else would happen outside this room. And maybe I misunderstood, but I liked it being sorted in this room.
So if I can cover this point, the issue with the original wording is to make the condition so it would be enforceable and meet the test. The wording had the words where possible in. So the difficulty with a where possible is, yes, we've written down there should be a 25-metre buffer zone where possible, but we've only got writing, we don't have a plan. So the where possible becomes open to interpretation by the applicant, the wider public, the officers dealing with it if we have any concerns about enforcement. So actually, I think that's probably less transparent and clear and trustworthy than saying, give us a plan, the plan will be publicly available and we'll approve the plan, and then everyone will know where the buffer zone is, because where possible is always difficult legally. What does that mean? Different people will interpret it in different ways.
Okay, Councillor Mark Wilson.
Thank you. Just, I guess, 3 small points of clarification. Firstly, on the buffer zone, is it helpful to sort of be clear that we are looking for no building on the buffer zone at this point, which then kind of permits the green spine, but is very clear about no building, if that's helpful clarification?
I think the difficulty we would have is the definition of building under the Planning Act, and the definition of building under the Planning Act includes pretty much everything that's a construction enterprise. So if you write no building, that would actually, under the definitions in the Town and Country Planning Act, exclude the building of the things necessary in the green spine. So I don't think we can do that, but I think everyone in the room, the applicant and the officers who will be dealing with it, understand what members want to see.
Okay. Okay.
James?
I've been like a gazelle writing up a condition here. So I'll say this to Sarah and Adrian. So what I've got is prior to the commencement of development, notwithstanding the proofs hereby approved. So it's notwithstanding the standards hereby approved. So that's the green spine, etc., etc. Details of the buffer zone surrounding Rushington Copse shall be provided. That shall include a 25-metre buffer zone and be submitted to the local planning authority in writing. Notwithstanding the details hereby approved, no development shall take place within the buffer zone approved at all times thereafter. Okay. No one's shaking their heads at me. This is a good.
Well done. I think we got there in the end. Mark, sorry, Councillor Wilson.
Thank you. And then just wanted to make sure we've got the hydrology point that Councillor Howard mentioned around making sure that the ancient woodland is factored into the hydrology testing under the drainage. So when we're looking at the drainage, we're assessing the hydrology of the ancient woodland properly specifically.
I think it's worth mentioning as well during the construction phase as well, because sometimes sites end up with the drainage messed about in a considerable way. Could that be looked at as a condition?
Well, that is covered under the carve out of development. So development in terms of the Planning Act is defined by section 55 of the Town Country Plan Act 1990. It's my nerd moment. That would include subterranean work, so things like drainage channels, etc., get covered and they fall within section 55. So that carve out that I've just read out to you about no development shall take place within the buffer zone, approved at all times thereafter, would also cover that scenario as well.
Right, so the condition 10, the drainage scheme, that covers impact on the ancient woodland?
No, so this is the new condition relating to the buffer zone. So just to go over that again, it's prior to the commencement of development, so nothing happens on site, no drainage, nothing. Notwithstanding the plans hereby approved, that refers to the parameter plans, the green spine, etc. Details of the buffer zone surrounding Rushington Copse shall be provided. That shall include a 25-metre buffer zone submitted to the local planning authority for approval in writing. Notwithstanding the details hereby approved, no development shall take place in the buffer zone approved at all times thereafter. So that stops drainage works, etc., going into that zone.
Okay.
Just to give you a bit more comfort on that point, notwithstanding that condition anyway, we wouldn't want to be seeing drainage items going into root areas anyway of those zones. So it gets captured both ways, but that's a fail-safe condition just to provide that comfort.
Okay. And sorry, just finally on condition 4, it would be good to make it absolutely clear that what we're looking for is individually segregated cycle paths and footpaths rather than mixed use cycle path and footpath, and for that to be physically segregated. So there's either a curb or some other change in height, so that it is very clear what's a cycle path and what's a footpath. That would, avoid a number of issues elsewhere we have in the borough on mixed use paths and make it absolutely clear that, and that is consistent with LTN 120. Or the best practice in LTM 120. So it'd be good to just be clear on that.
So condition 4, so condition 4 criteria 2 does state segregated pedestrian and cycle routes.
So on other developments, I've seen that interpreted as a shared use path. So if that can be individually and physically segregated pedestrian and cycle, or some wording which says they're both different.
Physically, so.
Yeah. Thank you.
Condition 4.2.2. That's physically segregated, yeah?
Yeah, some wording means we're not talking about two different things, footpaths and cycle paths being separate.
Yeah. Then we've also then got the criteria 5, which is to meet or exceed the criteria set out in LTM 120 as well. I mean, just to provide some comfort over that point, more than happy to change a condition. Obviously, the gift is yours, not mine. I can just advise you and guide you through that process. But obviously, going back to the recommendation, one of the recommendations about bringing reserve matters back to the panel.
Yeah.
One of those, the first reserve matters set out in the condition will be the green spine anyway. So if that didn't meet your expectations and the applicants are in the audience listening to what you are saying, then I highly doubt you'd be supporting the application. But we can do belt and braces. It's not a problem.
Again, thank you.
If everybody should have their all the bits and pieces we need or something, and obviously we do come to the dreadful part of the evening where we have to start making decisions about things. Obviously, we need a proposition to either agree to the officer's recommendations or to reject the officer's recommendation, whichever way the panel feels. Do we have anybody wishing to go either way as a proposition? Councillor Grove.
I'll put forward a motion to propose that we accept officers' recommendations to approve the outline plan, including the conditions that we've set out.
Very good. We'll lay those out before anything moves forward. Do we have a seconder for that motion? Councillor Howard?
I propose to second that motion on the conditions that we've already set out, especially including the one about Thames Water.
Do we have any other propositions either way, or is that the only proposition that we have? We will close the debate now then, and we will move to a name vote in a moment. It would be handy if we can have Mikey do the full recommendation, and hopefully he's captured the conditions as well. So this is your challenge, Mikey. Okay. So
Thank
if
you,
you'd like
Chair.
to,
Yes, so I will
announce the.
I will go through it all slowly, and I will say who's proposed and seconded at the end, so we're all happy with what's happening. So the motion on the table is to obviously grant the outline plan permission subject to the completion of a satisfactory legal agreement and subject to the conditions listed in section 14 of the report, and obligation to include details of management and monitoring arrangements of the open space to be amended to also include management of woodland. Prior to commencement of development, notwithstanding the plans hereby approved, details of the buffer zone surrounding Rushden Corps shall be provided. That shall include a 25-metre buffer zone to the local planning authority for approval in writing. Notwithstanding the details hereby approved, no development shall take place within the buffer zone, approved at all times thereafter. Condition 11 to be updated to include reference to relocation of wildlife, including a wildlife corridor, which is going to be in consultation with the chair. To amend Thames Water Fowl, condition 36 to trigger at pre-commencement of the relevant parcel. To require all reserved matters applications to be referred back to committee. Additional condition to require each reserved matters to be accompanied by a transport statement, including details of how the development responds to the modelling work undertaken. And that is proposed by Councillor Grove, seconded by Councillor Howard.
Can we just check the conditions, wording and conditions?
I just wanted to double check the trigger for the Thames Water one. I thought we said pre-above slab level, but are we doing full pre-com? Okay, I just wanted to be clear.
Okay.
And to include an updated condition regarding include a physically segregated pedestrian cycle route.
This says.
Yes. Which one said now?
Me? Sorry. The Thames Water one was about, also we would like it to come back to this panel to be approved that they have met the condition, rather than it being something that just happens outside the room, which has been proposed in previous times by Thames Water. So we would like that, shall we say, update of the system to be notified and come back to this panel for approval. Is that possible?
A moment of reflection going on here.
I can hear a coin being tossed.
Is it the kind of thing that's best suited with a note to go forward rather than a condition?
I suppose my reticence is, obviously it can come back towards panel for approval, but what we will end up with is very lengthy details of drainage calculations, and then a professional opinion from the consultee, which is drainage officer and Thames Water. So I suppose there is that. If you want it to come back to panel, we can, but I'm just preparing you for the fact that it will end up being a set of very technical drainage documents you will have to look at with guidance from a professional officer on it.
We got wording that might fit for that?
I think is that I understand your point, but I think there's a transparency and accountability bonus about getting them to come back here and say, we've done something, It builds trust in a body where there is a large amount of distrust at the moment. So I think there would be a lot of positivity for them as well as everybody else if it was to come back here to be said, we did A, B, and C, and it is ticked off, it is done.
James, have we got wording that might fit there as a condition?
I'm going to probably put Sarah on the spot here, but I just want to for everyone's sakes tonight, just refer you back to paragraph 57 of the MPPF. That talks about the 5 tests for imposing conditions. And that does require us to be necessary, relevant to planning and development permitted, enforceable, precise and reasonable on all other respects. So we would have to just make sure that that condition meets those tests, which it does. In terms of taking it back to committee, it's doable, but the way the permission is structured, we're going to have lots of reserve matters, which will all be coming back to committee at the same time. We could bring it back at the same time as those reserve matters. I wouldn't want to be bringing back condition discharges to you every single opportunity because we will be here for a long, long time. We will do. So it might just be that we bring it back alongside the corresponding reserve matters application at the same time. So we kill 2 birds with 1 stone. So that's.
So I think across the borough, there are quite a few of these, shall we say, challenges with the sewage network. And I think is that it would be positive. I don't expect it to be continuous. I expect it to be that they've updated and improved the capacity. They can prove it. And therefore it's discharged, I presume, at some point for the whole site, not for every parcel. But I'm happy to work with whatever you think works. It's more the case of getting it done and getting it shown to be done.
Yeah, I would suggest we be bringing it back in line with the reserve matters. We're triggering it prior to commencement. We've got to get that. So they can't commence on site. But in terms of when we bring it back to panel, that's probably come back with the reserve matters so we can sort of kill 2 birds with 1 stone. That's just a efficiency point around the operations of committees. So hopefully that'll be an extra update from Mikey just to bring back the discharge of the Thames water condition with the corresponding reserve matters application for the relevant parcel. Thames water condition is 36. There we go. I just have one final point as well, just about I'll blame my own trumpet, my fantastically worded condition about the buffer zone around Rushden Copse. The bit I did omit from that was actually to provide the buffer zone. So that's very, very basic day 1 problems of conditions drafting. So for Mikey's benefit, I'll just read it out to you. So we've got prior to the commencement of development, notwithstanding the plans hereby approved, details of the buffer zone surrounding Rushden Copse shall be provided. That shall include a 25-metre buffer zone to the local planning authority for approval in writing. Then I need to put the buffer zone hereby approved shall be provided on site.
Sorry, Councillor, if I could just.
Yeah, sure.
So I just wanted to say, I think in the delegation, because it's always difficult when you're drafting these things on the night, in the delegations that are in the officer's report, there is a provision for minor changes to things to sort out, for example, legal tests. So, I think we have noted down all of the important things that members want from these conditions, but I think just for transparency, if we as officers go away and think actually it needs these 3 words adding to make sure it's really robust and meets the legal tests, then under the recommendation, I would have delegated authority to add them, because I think we run the risk of trying to word things on the fly tonight that really we could do with James and myself sitting down with clear heads tomorrow and working out in detail. So I think we've got all the key things written down, but if there's extra words like, and then you will provide the buffer, we will make sure they're added outside of this meeting before a consent's issued. And I think I just wanted to provide that clarity.
If we're all happy that the spirit of the conditions is there, the outcomes that we require are there, we have proposers. Sorry.
Sorry, just to check on the conditions, that we've got conditions 3, 5 and 6 being determined by the panel. I may have misheard when you read it out, but I didn't quite catch that one. So it's the reserve matters and the 2 design codes. those will be determined by panel. Yeah, thank you.
Can we just double check the word?
And 6, which is the reserve matters, and then the North Neighbourhood Design Code and the Southern Neighbourhood Design Code, that when the submissions come in, they are determined by panel. Yeah, or each of the submissions in those conditions come in. They're determined by the Maidenhead Development Management Committee. No, 3, 5 and 6.
I'm saying in total, I'm just looking
Condition
at going
3.
total. I'm just looking at going total. We've got 8 conditions now in total though, so if that's for 3.
Okay, so
I know you're talking about condition 3 in the report. I'm sorry, Councillor Wilson.
yes, conditions 3, 5 and 6. So it's all the reserve matters, and then the design code for the North and the design code for the South.
Yeah, so when submissions for design code of each condition 3, 5 and 7 from the main report. Sorry, I'm just getting confused obviously because James has given me separate 8 conditions, which obviously I've been reading off that. Lovely. So one last time, I'll try and read them all out. So it's for the obligation to include details of management and monitoring arrangements for the open space to be amended to also include management of woodland. Prior to the commencement of development, notwithstanding the plans hereby approved, details of the buffer zone surrounding Rushington Copse shall be provided. It shall include a 25-metre buffer zone to the local planning authority. For approval in writing, the buffer zone hereby approved shall be provided on site prior to commencement of development. Notwithstanding the details hereby approved, no development shall take place within the buffer zone approved at all times. The reason for that is in the interest of protection of the ancient woodland. For the condition 11 to be updated to include reference to relocation of wildlife, including a wildlife corridor. The amended Thames waterfowl condition to trigger pre-commencement, obviously we were talking about slab level. Requirement for all reserve matters to come back to the panel. Additional conditions require each reserve matters to be accompanied by a transport statement, including details of how development responds to modelling work undertaken. Update the condition 4 to include the physical segregation of pedestrian and cycle routes. Then with submissions for the design code, and each conditions of 3, 5 and 7 are determined by the committee.
5 and 6.
6, sorry, 3, 5 and 6 to come back. And that is proposed by Councillor Grove and seconded by Councillor Howard.
Can we proceed to a name vote then, please?
Yes, so I will be asking councillors if they are for approval, against refusal or abstaining from the vote. Councillor Devon Davies.
Need to wait for the microphone. 4.
Councillor Goslin. 4. Councillor Grove. 4. Councillor Howard. 4. Councillor Knowles. 4. Councillor Kashmir Singh. 4. Councillor Wilson.
4.
That is unanimous, Chair, and the motion carries.
That concludes the business for this evening. Thank you for everybody's forbearance this evening. And thanks to the officers for a really well produced report and the members for a really interesting debate and set of questions. I thought very good. Thank you very much indeed. And I think we're now.
Residents, I think they're not happy with this. I think it's very upsetting that you had an option to try and get out of this meeting.